I too am clapping that it's the last session. So this is the important part of the story, Communism 3.0. Corporate communism is the title here. How did communism go corporate is really the question that this day and hour needs, but it's also the question that this workshop was organized specifically to answer. So what we're going to do for this session is go to Klaus Schwab's School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, also known as Schwabwarts, or the Schwabwarts, I should say. But the way that this works, the way corporate communism works, and that's a name that I want to use a lot of. We could give others. I'll give you a list in a minute. The way that I want to talk, I want people to start talking about corporate communism like it's a thing, because it is a thing, and without being able to name the thing, it's hard to fight the thing. And I think we have to name it as communism because it's very communist. But it's very obviously that people are saying it can't be communist because it's using the corporations have what seems to be a very effective argument to derail you if you try to point out that what's happening is communist. So we have to be able to articulate that we're dealing with a new manifestation of communism. It has evolved. That was the point of this workshop, is to explain how it evolved to this point and the way that it works. To co-opt and make use of corporate power, not just state power, which is a completely different phenomenon. So the co-optation of the corporations has really unlocked the riddle of history, so to speak. So we're really going to talk about that a lot. But I want you to just start by imagining, let's say that we had, it's very famous that Deng Xiaoping, after Mao left power, said that he was going to generate socialism with Chinese characteristics. And a lot of times this gets inappropriately, I've done it many times myself, inappropriately given to Mao's credit and say that Mao developed Marxism with Chinese characteristics, which is not exactly true, or Marxism-Leninism with Chinese characteristics. Mao made one kind of offhanded remark apparently at some point. It's sort of like that, but not, he never actually said it. Deng Xiaoping said socialism with Chinese characteristics. So imagine we had communism with American characteristics coming off of that linguistic construction to understand what we're talking about. A fully developed communism with American characteristics. What would it look like? Well, obviously it would take advantage of the identity politics relevant to the American history and context. So we would see the woke stuff. But Calvin Coolidge, approximately, speaking of misattributed or imperfect quotes, Calvin Coolidge, President Coolidge, very famously said something that has been summarized as the business of America is business. So if we really did have a fully developed, fully fledged communism with American characteristics, it had better come through the businesses, because that's how America works. America works through businesses. So we would expect in American communism to use American identity politics as the kind of agitprop base, and we would expect it to come through corporations, because those are the kind of backbone of the American economy, or in other words, productive enterprises. So maybe paradoxically, a fully developed American communism would be, in fact, corporate communism. So I want us to start trying to get comfortable calling what we're dealing with corporate communism. Now, like in the other lectures, I want to give you a bunch of possible other names. I've called it neoliberal communism. They might, if they were so bold, call it sustainable and inclusive communism. If they really wanted to get to the point of how they want to organize the economy and their new planned economy, they would call it well-being communism. You should actually look and see. You'll see how much stuff, not just in this kind of corporate literature, talks about well-being, 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 but you'll actually see, if you look up the well-being economy, that there's this well-developed theory of replacing GDP with a measurement of well-being, how good our lives are in some, sense that I'm sure is going to be defined by communists. We could call it global citizenship communism, or just global communism, because that's really what's happening. I got in trouble on Twitter yesterday because I said what's happening right now is a semi-global communist revolution, and somebody shot back at me. What do you mean semi? It's all global. I was like, no, they already did one in China. We could call it fascio-communism because it uses the fascist corporatist model. We could call it public-private communism. I'm just giving you like different names. But we don't hear these named. The enemy, if you will, names these things in different ways, but they don't call them communism. They call them forms of capitalism. Remember Lenin's word trick that I brought up, where you now give something you're familiar with but probably couldn't quite define two versions? Well, now what we have are modified versions of capitalism. So we have stakeholder capitalism to replace shareholder capitalism. I'm going to, I hope, convince you that the right name for stakeholder capitalism would be stakeholder Sovietism. We hear sustainable capitalism, inclusive capitalism, or putting it together, sustainable and inclusive capitalism. And this runs in parallel to some imaginary unicorn of the socialist world that we might hear or imagine being called productive socialism, which is, of course, an oxymoron. So the big idea of what corporate communism represents is that it is a dialectical fusion of state and corporate power, and that combination of state and corporate power is actually necessary to transform man and society. So if we go back to the actual goal of communism, which is not to implement the Soviet Union, the goal of communism is to transform man and society in this theosophical communist religious cult, then it's not that hard to say, well, why wouldn't it let itself use corporations if that's where a huge power base is? A lot of you are knowledge, you know who Vivek Ramaswamy is, and he has a very famous way of putting this, that what they cannot accomplish through the front door of government, they accomplish through the back door of corporations. So you have these two huge power reservoirs that actually both threaten individual liberty. And imagine if rather than having two knives, you could use them like scissors. And that's kind of what you have with this sort of fusion of state and corporate power. And of course, when you fuse state and corporate power, you are dealing with fascist elements. It's just what you're dealing with. So you have this weird dialectical combination, if you will, of communism with some fascism mixed in to make it work. Or a communist model with a little bit of National Socialist production standards brought in, because if the Germans could do one thing, well, you think I'm going to say make the trains run on time. I'm not. They could build stuff. The German war economy during World War II could crank out machinery. And so they could produce, and they could produce big and fast, but they had a totalitarian system. What do they covet in the communist world? A totalitarian system with the correct values that can actually produce. And so why not borrow from what has worked and cut away the bad elements that they don't like? Of course they would. The way this is going to be brought into being is through what I've already kind of hinted and warmed you up, a top-down, bottom-up, inside-out transformation of society to a new meta-system that is sustainable and inclusive in its value structure to organize for a single global citizenship. Now, global citizenship is a scam. There is no global citizen. You are not a global citizen. Do not get sucked into the propaganda. How do I know you're not a global citizen? Yes, I know you live on the globe. I understand that you are a person of Earth. I don't think there are any Martians. Elon Musk hasn't succeeded quite yet. I understand that. But a citizenship relationship is a relationship between a government and the people it governs. And we do not have a global government. So you are not a global citizen. But if you read the global citizenship literature, which is copious, the United Nations is extraordinarily strongly behind this, you would be led to believe that we're all global citizens. It's very cosmopolitan. You can travel. It'll be like a global EU, which is fantastic, right? Or a United States of Earth is a way that Robert Mueller sometimes calls it. And we can all just travel and be, and we're all basically in the same big thing. And what they can do then is justify this sense of, worldliness within you under this name global citizen to say, well, let's make good on it and talk about the rights and responsibilities. So the global government has to come into being to secure your rights and to define your responsibilities and duties. And they tell you literally in their literature, the global citizenship literature, that it's not actually all that interested in the rights of citizens. It is interested in their responsibilities, which means it's totalitarian or at least totalist. It's going to operate through a Soviet. I already gave you the punchline on that, the stakeholder Soviet. So remember, our democratic workers' councils in the Soviet Union were made up of workers, and only workers, right? But you weren't a real worker unless you were an enlightened, awakened socialist worker, so you had to be a member of the elect. So now what we're going to do is we're going to say, well, you know, we can't look in such a narrow way at corporate activity. We can't follow Milton Friedman's advice and pay attention to shareholder value and shareholder return. Corporations actually have a lot more responsibility than that. There are a lot of people in society, and if the corporation makes more money by polluting an environment, the people in that environment have a stake in what that corporation does. The government does. The entire nation, or in fact everybody in the world, in some sense, has a stake in what the corporation does because it's producing, it's creating, you know, whether it's pollution or other externalities or damages. It's collecting resources that are scarce and therefore other people can't have them. Everybody has a stake. The people who are the consumers have a stake in the quality of the products and other things. So everybody has a stake. It's just like the workers and the masses are everybody in the Soviet. But this everybody doesn't get to show up at the Democratic Council. Only the enlightened, qualified workers, the members of the Soviet, get to show up. So the stakeholders, you're a stakeholder in what Microsoft does and what Boeing does and it doesn't matter what the company, I'm just pulling some out of the air that I happen to have popped to mind. You're a stakeholder in that, but you're not going to have a say in what they do because we have to use experts instead. So they're going to be expert councils that are run democratically, but the only people that are allowed to be in the expert councils are the experts. And they're not necessarily just experts in, say, aircraft manufacture for Boeing. They have to be experts in all of the transdisciplinary impacts that it'll have in every aspect of the economy and life. In other words, you have the same Gnostic elect of self-appointed democratic representatives that are going to form the stakeholder councils, which is why I don't want to call it stakeholder capitalism. I want to call it stakeholder Sovietism, and that they are setting up a stakeholder Soviet that will represent you without you ever having elected a single person that's involved in it. They're all self-appointed. Where in the world, James, did you get this crazy idea, plus the top-down, bottom-up, inside-out transformation of society? You made that up. Right? Well, first of all, I got the verbiage top down, bottom up, inside out. Let me give credit where credit's due first. I got that verbiage from Mike in the back corner here, specifically. But actually, the first time I heard it said by somebody who wasn't telling me about it, but who was promoting it, was from Van Jones when he was working in the Obama administration. And he said exactly that Obama's fundamental transformation of America was going to be top down, bottom up, and inside out, which means it's going to hit from every possible dimension all at once, in everything, everywhere, all at once, which suggests that they're going to need a massive amount of coordination to pull it off. But let's read from, since we're at Schwabwarts, I'm really tickled with the joke I thought of while we were getting ready to start here. Let's read from Klaus Schwab, from The Great Narrative for a Better Future, which is his most recent wonderful book. Okay, top down. Actually, these are a little bit long quotes. I didn't want to make really long quotes from this, but it turns out he's not as bad as some of the others, but it's difficult to pick out exactly. He talks about these things a lot, though. But so top down, corporations and government are going to work in partnership, a public-private partnership, and they're going to do that in coordination with the steering councils, essentially, that are located in major nonprofit organizations that have the right values and also have huge reservoirs of money to make things happen and can avoid taxes and other things in order to be able to do that. So for top down, he says, nowadays, business leaders no longer consider the improvement of stakeholder value as an option. For all the reasons expanded in other parts of this book, they know that there is no alternative way forward. That is the reason why, in the coming years, measuring ESG performance will be the gold standard of business adherence to stakeholder value. So it's not what you actually do. The stakeholder Soviet is going to be based off of measuring ESG performance. He just tells you how it works right there. Many businesses do not have an interest in making the world better, and some will be tempted to engage in green or woke washing. But they'll be forced to commit to ESG, and ultimately all the commitments will be put to the test by government action and societal pressure. The difference between good governments and bad governments will be measured in how fast they implement the transition to net zero, while providing concomitantly a welfare policy that makes societies fairer and more prosperous. So why'd you call it sustainable and inclusion? There you go. Nothing prevents the greater role of government accompanying the progress of humanity. The state doesn't have to be an impediment, it can be a facilitator. So there you go, top down. Bottom up, that's going to be popular movements in education. I'm going to tell you most of those are, the popular movements are mostly AstroTurf. These big organizations pay for what was called, in the analysis of how Mao ran his country, Mao did not call it this, planned spontaneity, which means that they did a theater production to make it look like some spontaneous protest came up or whatever. So there's going to be popular movements. There's also going to be the rampant miseducation of youth into new values in order to get them to support the exact same program. So the ESG is coming from top down, but they're going to create a bottom-up demand, especially in the youth, through popular movements and theater and broken education. This is unfortunately even more to read from Klaus. Young people, he says, have a deep desire for radical change because they see the broken path ahead. So how will this generation respond? By proposing radical solutions and often radical action. So with radicalism, to prevent issues like social inequalities from worsening or the next disaster like climate change from striking. So sustainability and inclusion. The young generation see both as two facets of the same coin, intergenerational inequality. It will most likely demand a radical alternative to the present course because its members are frustrated and dogged by a nagging belief that the current system has failed them and is fractured beyond repair. As a result, youth activism is increasing worldwide, being revolutionized by social media that fosters mobilization to an extent that would have been impossible before. So there's a lot of planned spontaneity on there. We just learned, for example, that the Democratic Party is paying influencers an awful lot to pretend that they like Kamala Harris. They also pay influencers an awful lot to support all kinds of their initiatives. There are a lot of young people all over TikTok and Instagram on the payroll of big government pretending that they're rebels against the existing society. And they know that they can do this. They know that they can capture the influencers and the youth to do this. And they know that it influences especially young people more than anybody else to see their peers doing, nurse dances and other TikTok dances for the politician or whatever else. Klaus goes on, he says it takes many different forms, ranging from non-institutionalized political participation, well, there you go, right, what I just said, to demonstrations and protests. Somebody's paying for those, by the way. I tell you what, as much as I love a bunch of 19-year-olds or whatever, they did not organize a big, giant protest and all show up on a Saturday morning. They didn't do it. They didn't, somebody's paying them. They didn't also show up with identical signs that were very clearly printed in professional facilities, which if you look at this, look at their protests and look how many of the signs are not only identical, but professionally produced. Have you ever looked at when kids show up, like teenagers and young adults show up with posters? They're on poster boards they bought for 35 cents at Walgreens and colored with glitter. They are not professional printed objects in the dozens or hundreds that are identical. So they're going to, these are the things that they're manufacturing, right? So it could be non-institutionalized political participation to demonstrations and protests, and addresses inequality in a multifaceted manner, seeing issues as diverse as income inequalities, climate change, so climate change is an inequality, guys, economic reforms, gender equality, and LGBTQ rights as part of a more general inequality problem. There's your intersectionality, or as I said before, there is your American Maoism. The young generation is firmly at the vanguard of social change. There is little doubt that it will be the catalyst for change. So one of the things that if we'd spent more time on Mao, I would have covered was that I said that he stoked youth rebellions in particular, but what I didn't indicate clearly enough to you is that the youth became the vanguard of changing the culture. And we hear that now today. We're always supposed to listen to the children, believe the children. Apparently children are never wrong about anything somehow now. Because of course they haven't been poisoned by growing up in our twisted, awful society yet. So they're more pure and innocent in a very Rousseau fashion. But there's your bottom up. and it's manufactured bottom-up. It's not organic bottom-up. It's not emergent bottom-up. They are breaking our children to turn them into activists and paying their peers to put on a show to get them to do it. It's completely fake bottom-up. So it's actually bottom-up coming from the top down. Inside out. Klaus Schwab says no fewer than a dozen, but maybe, depending on how you count them, as many as 20 times in this book, that we need a new social contract. Rising concerns about inequality and the profound sentiment of dissatisfaction, if not anger, that it provokes, will prompt many societies around the world to redefine the terms of their social contract. While reflecting on the contours we think a future social contract might follow, we ignore at our peril the opinion of the younger generation, who will be asked to live with it. Their adherence is decisive, and thus, to better understand what they want, we must not forget to listen. Listen to the kids, listen to the kids, listen to the kids that we're brainwashing at school and through their entertainment. Listen to the kids. This is all the more significant because the younger generation is likely to be more radical in its demands in the refashioning of our current social contract. So there's your inside-out change. What is an inside-out change? It's a change in the values that we have in society. It's a change in the expectations and norms that we have, how we treat one another, what we expect out of one another, and what we agree to in terms of whether it's civility or interaction or whatever else. It's this kind of diffuse glue that holds the society together, allegedly. That's how he defines it, at least somewhere else in the book, is the glue that holds society together. And so we're going to have new glue holding society together in new ways. It's going to be defined according to these aspects. And of course, what was the second chapter of Essay on Liberation from Herbert Marcuse? A New Sensibility, which is another way of saying the exact same thing. And what was Herbert Marcuse's point? That sustainability and inclusion are actually some of the pieces that are missing. So this new sensibility, as I put a podcast out about maybe 2 or 3 years ago actually, is sustainability and inclusion. That's the new value set. Sustainability and inclusion, not as generic terms that anybody can access and understand for themselves, but as defined by the stakeholder Soviet. And therefore that can change. What's an example of them changing, right? So remember Elon Musk made Tesla, and that's like electric cars, so he had a really good ESG score, and then he bought Twitter, and then that was really bad because free speech would come back in, so they dropped his S score and accused him of having a racist company, and his ESG score went through the floor. Or remember that before the conflict between Russia and Ukraine broke out, companies like Dick Cheney's Halliburton were weapons of war. That's not good social policy. So they didn't have great ESG scores, but then all of a sudden we need bombs to blow up Ukrainians or Russians or some of both or whoever. And therefore, Halliburton's ESG score went through the roof because the both environmental and social concerns brought upon by the war meant that that's good now. So they can change the rules of what's ESG compliant as they go. It's arbitrary power. COVID was an environmental contagion, so you have to make lots and lots and lots of masks because masks contain, allegedly, it turns out they don't, contain the environmental contagion, so that's good e-scoring for your company until something awful like 300 billion of them ended up in the ocean. So that's what's actually going on. Top-down, bottom-up, inside-out change through all facets of society to install a stakeholder Soviet to run corporate communism for a transformation of the West to match what's happening in China in our own Western way. And the question is, how did we get here? How did this happen? Well, let's start here with something that we heard before from Marx. The end of his famous paragraph about communism being the positive transcendence of private property as human self-estrangement. The last sentence of that paragraph was, communism is the riddle of history solved, and it knows itself to be the solution. And so here they think they've solved the riddle of history. If we can get the states and the corporations not to fight with one another, but rather to work together to create a values system change for the entire population, then we can bring us into a new sustainable and inclusive future. So solving the so-called riddle of history is the task of bringing all of the threads we've discussed so far together into one thing. And the man who set the vision for that is Herbert Marcuse. So even though he was a critical theorist, and we're going to go back to the 1960s to see what he had to say in One-Dimensional Man and Essay on Liberation about these issues. So from his introduction to that book, One-Dimensional Man being his kind of magnum opus, sold 300,000 copies or thereabouts in 1964, if I read that correctly. Extremely influential is the point to that. The fact that the vast majority of the population accepts and is made to accept this society does not render it less irrational and less reprehensible. Remember, he was in Santa Monica and hated everything? Look how nice it is. I'm mad. The distinction between true and false consciousness, real and immediate interest is still meaningful, but this distinction itself must be validated. Men must come to see it and to find their way from false to true consciousness, from their immediate to their real interests. They can do so only if they live in the need of changing their way of life, of denying the positive, of refusing. It is precisely this need which the established society manages to repress to the degree to which it is capable of delivering the goods on an increasingly large scale and using the scientific conquest of nature for the scientific conquest of man. So what he's saying is, to the degree that society can make stuff work, be prosperous, deliver the goods, is the degree to which it represses their ability to see what can be unburdened by what has been. One-Dimensional Man is ultimately an analysis of the need to consider technology as a value-laden thing. So we need a Marxist theory of technology now coming out in the 1960s. He says the classical Marxian theory envisages the transition from capitalism to socialism as a political revolution. The proletariat destroys the political apparatus of capitalism but retains the technological apparatus, subjecting it to socialization. In common English, we call that robbery. We call that theft. We call that stealing. But we've built up all this stuff in our capitalist societies, and socialism works because they're going to steal all the stuff capitalism built and run it to do socialism. They're literally saying that was the Marxist theory. And Marcuse goes on to say, there is continuity in the revolution, technological rationality. So the technology itself has a way of thinking and a way of teaching and telling people. Technological rationality, freed from irrational restrictions and destruction, sustains and consummates itself in the new society. So what he's telling us here is that the old socialist plan was we're going to take the means of production, but the means of production themselves are contaminated with capitalism. So we don't actually get away, and that's why the Soviet Union happened. We're still doing the oppressive, repressive system that capitalism built up by stealing its technology. So we actually have to think of technology itself as value-laden and do a Marxist theory of it, which means Marxism can't successfully obtain its goal until we start to think of technology itself as something that can deliver socialism, which means we need technology geared toward socialist circumstances, not capitalist circumstances to do that. Now, of course, the real problem that Marcuse is looking at here is not what he just said about technological rationality. I don't think he's right. The real problem is that Marxism is a parasite that steals stuff and doesn't know how to use it and ruins it. But we'll stick with Marcuse for the moment. In advanced capitalism, technical rationality is embodied in spite of its irrational use in the productive apparatus. Neither nationalization nor socialization alter by themselves this physical embodiment of technological rationality. So it doesn't matter if you make it a collective, it's still people see it as property, and they still have the property thing, specter weighing on their minds, and they're still ultimately thinking like capitalists. It says, on the contrary, the latter remains a precondition for the socialist development of all productive forces. To be sure, Marx held that organization and direction of the productive apparatus by the immediate producers would introduce a qualitative change, and that's a very key term, qualitative change, in the technical community, namely production toward the satisfaction of freely developing individual needs. However, to the degree to which the established technical apparatus engulfs the public and private existence in all spheres of society, that is, becomes the medium of control and cohesion in a political universe which incorporates the laboring classes, to that degree would the qualitative change involve a change in the technological structure itself. So again, we need socialist technology. And so what's the issue that he's really driving at with all this technological baloney that I probably didn't need to read that last part? The overpowering productivity of this society's supreme promise is an ever more comfortable life for an ever-growing number of people. who in a strict sense cannot imagine a qualitatively different universe of discourse and action. Ever more, forever more people. Unsustainable. Those whose life is hell of the affluent society are kept in line by a brutality which revives medieval and early modern practices. For the other, less underprivileged people, society takes care of the need for liberation by satisfying the needs which make servitude palatable and perhaps even unnoticeable, and it accomplishes this fact in the process of production itself. The first part, though, said, for the people that capitalism doesn't fully work for, it's a living hell, because capitalism is not actually inclusive. So we lack inclusivity in capitalism, and we lack sustainability. The problem with capitalism, to Herbert Marcuse, is not that it cannot produce. It's that it overproduces, and it doesn't distribute fairly. It is not sustainable, and it is not inclusive. This is in the 1960s. He's just not using those exact words. He then gives a very long discussion about how capitalism and communism are in a dialectical relationship with one another as two forms of industrial and technological societal systems. He says, indeed, society must first create the material prerequisites of freedom for all its members before it can be a free society. So you have to have enough production in order to be able to actually achieve socialism. It must first create the wealth before being able to distribute it according to the freely developing needs of the individual. So roll back in time to when Lenin decides to take over a bumpkin peasant society in Russia that doesn't have the material prerequisites for freedom for all of its members. Whoops, he did it too early. You can't rush into a socialist society out of a feudal society because you didn't make enough stuff for the communists to steal yet. It's the same criticism that Marx leveled against Babeuf from the first lecture that we shared, where you can't even be a socialist who understands the better stuff because you don't even have anything yet to know what you're missing. So all you end up with is a gross, crude communism. It's an exact echo of the same thing. But the thing is what he's actually saying is socialism, everywhere it's been tried, has failed to produce the needs of the people. So you have capitalism produces but is unsustainable and exclusive, but on the other hand, socialism has the right ideology, but it cannot produce. So now you have a problem. Imagine if you could mix them. Imagine if you could have a socialist capitalism or capitalist socialism that might actually work. You know, a capitalist socialism like we have in China, or an increasingly socialist capitalism like we're building in the West, or any other fascist model, actually. So there's a rub here for Marcuse's vision. The technological form of production in capitalism comes into socialism. They bring the technological mentality of capitalism into socialism if you go from capitalism directly into socialism. So you can't take Marx's program of, the 6 stages of history where number 4, capitalism, jumps into number 5, socialism, because you drag capitalism along with you into socialism and contaminate it. But on the other hand, socialism has to be able to produce and it can't figure out how to do it. So what are you going to do? Like I said, you've got to have some mix, a capitalist socialism and a socialist capitalism, or some version of that, or both, that are now mixing together across the world. He says, on these grounds, there arises a universe of administration in which depressions are controlled and conflicts stabilized by the beneficial effects of growing productivity and threatening nuclear war. Is this stabilization temporary in the sense that it does not affect the roots of the conflicts which Marx found in the capitalist mode of production, which is the contradiction between private ownership and the means of production and social productivity? Or is it a transformation of the antagonistic social structure itself, which resolves the contradictions by making them tolerable? And if the second alternative is true, and this is the sentence this whole paragraph is here for, how does it change the relationship between capitalism and socialism, which made the latter appear the historical negation of the former? So remember before, socialism was supposed to be the thing that comes after capitalism, so it's the historical negation of capitalism, but somehow that has not worked because it dragged the capitalist technical rationality along with, and you still had oppression. So I give you a diagram. You all have a copy of this. You don't have to squint or try to come up. You all should have a copy of this, and if you don't, you can get one very easily. At the top, I show you Marx's 6-stage historicism. Primitive communism goes to slavery. Slavery goes to feudalism. Feudalism goes to capitalism, which then ruptures into socialism, which then withers away to global communism. Those are the 6 stages of history. And then here's what we've just discussed, Marcuse's update. And honestly, the last 2 years of my life have been extraordinarily frustrating. I drew this picture on the bottom on an airplane napkin flying home from an event over 2 years ago and have been frustratedly trying to explain it to people. And then for this workshop, I said, why don't I just draw it? Why don't I just show people the picture? Which reminds me actually of my friend Stephen Coughlin, who said that he was writing increasingly complicated things trying to explain how political warfare works. And then he finally realized one day that he was trying to explain a picture. So he just drew the picture and cut out thousands of words of explanation. And so in this new update that we've just read, you have 2 paths to industrialization. Number 1, primitive communism does still allegedly historically move forward to slavery, which is then negated into feudalism. But then you have 2 options to industrialize, capitalist and socialist. And those 2 are actually, the 5th stage of history is not now going to be capitalism or socialism. It's one or the other of capitalism or socialism in relationship with one another, fighting it out in a dialectical warfare. And then I put a little swirly magic spell in between the 2, showing that they're mixing. And that swirl, that dialectical synthesis of capitalism and socialism, in other words, what I called capitalist socialism or socialist capitalism, is the thing that can wither away actually into global communism. And that is what they are doing. And Herbert Marcuse laid out the entire theory of it for us in the 1960s. And a lot of people today, like we'll talk about Kohei Saito here in a little bit, the Japanese degrowth communist, think that they're doing original work when they're really just ripping this dude off. So we have to understand that this is a different relationship where Marx thought that capitalism builds up until it's intolerable, and then you lead into socialism. And what Marcuse is saying, no, capitalism and socialism are 2 ways to build the industrial base, and they're in conflict with one another ideologically. But if you see them as 2 parts of a single dynamic, where they're competing with one another to see who can better provide production and the values necessary to be sustainable in production over the long haul, then you can actually realize that they have to share elements and blend together to get to a actual communism. His point is the thing that most of us refer to as communism when they say, James, it can't be communist because some 20th century nonsense argument that I don't care about. What they're actually talking about is that they're talking about the attempt to force socialist methods of production as an industrial model. And what's actually happening is that they said in order to make this work, we have to incorporate fascist elements of production into a communist model. They're both still totalitarian, but we have to have the production model that works in order to drive socialism forward. The thing is that capitalism and its negation, socialism, are actually a dialectical pair in communism going forward from the 60s for people who knew what was going on, people who understood what they were going to do to get to the qualitative change. That qualitative change, he said, didn't come out of socialism because they inherited the technological rationality, but I would say it's just because it doesn't work and it's a robbing, thieving mode. But since you didn't get to the qualitative change by going socialist, and you can't get to the qualitative change because of the repression of capitalist ideology built around a capitalist culture, built around capitalism, you must have to get there some other way, and that other way is corporate communism. That's where you're going to find the qualitative change. And what he talks about all the time is that there's an alternative, but neither the socialist countries nor the capitalist countries can see it because both are caught in their own distorted modes of acting. He says, the fateful interdependence of the 2 sovereign social systems in the contemporary world, capitalism and socialism, is expressive of the fact that the conflict between progress and politics, between man and his masters, has become total. When capitalism meets the challenge of communism, it meets its own capabilities. Spectacular development of all productive forces. Did I get this right? Yeah, okay. Spectacular development of all productive forces after the subordination of the private interest and profitability, which arrests such development. When communism meets the challenge of capitalism, it too meets its own capabilities. Spectacular comforts, liberties, and alleviation of the burden of life. We call that in the popular parlance today, crazy rich Asians. But both systems have these capabilities distorted beyond recognition And in both cases, the reason in the last analysis is the same, the struggle against a form of life which would dissolve the basis for domination. Remember when Marx said in his Opium of the Masses thing, his critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, that the criticism of religion would be the criticism of the reasons for suffering, and that would lead people to actually look for a real solution to their suffering? Same mentality brought back to life here. There is an actual communism, or an actual path to communism, which comes into this swirly thing in my picture, which is the struggle against a form of life that would dissolve the basis for domination. And both capitalism and socialism miss it. So rather than a 6-stage history, you have a 5-stage history with 2 paths at stage 5. And what you have to do is see that they both have pieces that are right and both have pieces that are wrong, and mix them into a new model. That's what I'm calling corporate communism. This, by the way, is a very original contribution to the research literature on this subject. James, what have you ever done in the world? Well, this. And OK Groomer. So what would a liberated communism look like, or a socialist capitalism look like? He says it would look like distribution of the necessities of life regardless of work performance. Isn't that what they all want? Didn't I tell you the whole motivation was that Marx didn't want to get a job? Distribution of the necessities of life regardless of work performance. I read this to my wife and she spit her drink laughing. Reduction of working time to a minimum. Universal all-sided education toward exchangeability of functions. These are the preconditions, but not the contents of self-determination. Well, the first UBI experiment, which ran for 3 years, just ended, and it showed that none of this works. You can't pay people $1,000 a month to do nothing. It turns out, I think it was every extra percent that you paid them, they lost like 1.2% of total income or something. They actually came out, even though they were being given money for free and could do whatever they wanted with their time, they made less money, including the money they were being given for free. They would take more time off. They would find more excuses to not work. They would take longer disability leave. They would every reason not to, well, I don't really have to. Which is basically our whole post-COVID world. A lot of the struggles you've probably experienced at an airport are due to the fact that they can't hire ground crew and keep them working there. We can blame DEI all we want, but the fact of the matter is a lot of people went home from COVID told they were non-essential workers, and they didn't feel like going back to work. They made a qualitative change in their life circumstances so that they didn't have to. And the whole goal, though, is everybody gets paid regardless of if it produces value, and we're going to work less. And everybody gets free education. It says, in fact, toward exchangeability of functions, so that people can be whatever they want to be, which is fine. Like, let's say that you wanted to be an engineer this week, but you've never studied calculus or any engineering. That's okay, because you're going to get distribution of the necessities of life regardless of work performance. But what in the world would it be that you would be educated in that you can just go wherever and be a productive person? Oh, you'd have to be a consultant. I'm making a little bit of a joke here, but they call it transdisciplinarity. So it's this idea that the actually technical people have a very low-level understanding of how stuff works. What you actually need are these kind of enlightened masters who understand what Plato would have called the episteme of the situation, rather than just the stupid techne and dianoia that allow you to understand. I don't ever say dianoia. I don't ever say that right. It's the same split. It's what Hegel called Vernunft, which is reason, above Verstand, which is understanding. It's the exact same model. You have to have these people who are basically artists and social sciences going around and telling the engineers what to do so that it'll be more sustainable and inclusive. Those are the only people who can flit around and go from place to place and pull down a 7-figure salary for their status as an ESG officer or a DEI officer. These people with these bullshit government jobs that go around and tell other people how to do their job even though it doesn't work. That's what's actually what you're supposed to be educated for, and is that not what we educate for? We live in Herbert Marcuse's world. I've said it again and again since 2019, and I will continue to say it again and again forever. He built the architecture of the world that we live in the program that they're running, including the repressive tolerance, two-tier cure system that we live in. So this analysis in One-Dimensional Man, and again in the Essay on Liberation, so that's 1964 and 1969 are the 2 years on those, put capitalism and socialism on similar footing as a dialectical pair that require synthesis into a qualitatively different new system, which I'm calling corporate communism or communism 3.0. Both are paths to industrialization of a feudal state. My notes say mention graphic. Obviously, I already jumped the gun on that. The point is that capitalism can produce but is wasteful and not sustainable, and it's also exclusive, therefore not inclusive. Here's how he phrased it in Essay on Liberation. The question of what liberation looks like concretely, that's my summary of a big waffling paragraph. The question of what liberation looks like concretely cannot be brushed aside by saying that what matters today is the destruction of the old, of the powers that be, making way for the emergence of the new. Such an answer neglects the essential fact that the old is not simply bad, that it delivers the goods, and that people have a real stake in it. There's that stake holding thing. And socialism is allegedly not wasteful and sustainable, and it's also inclusive, but it's very poor at producing. He says, the goal implies rejection of those policies of reconstruction, no matter how revolutionary, which are bound to perpetuate or introduce the pattern of the unfree societies and their needs. Such false policy is perhaps best summed up in the formula to catch up with and overtake the productivity level of the advanced capitalist countries. In other words, he's criticizing, he doesn't actually tell you what he's criticizing, you have to figure it out. He's criticizing industrial communism and their drive to increase productivity. And he's saying that was the wrong way, guys. He says, what is wrong with this formula is not the emphasis on the rapid improvement in the material conditions, but on the model guiding their improvement. The model denies the alternative, which is the qualitative difference. The qualitative difference, guys, is the awakening to true socialist consciousness, that positive transcendence of private property as human self-estrangement that brings people back to their true social or human nature, as Marx put it. In other words, you're not religious enough, and that's why it hasn't worked. The commies in Soviet Union and China were not religious enough about it, so it didn't work. So you have to have an internal personal conversion to sustainability and inclusion to make it go. And also production, apparently. This is where we get corporate communism. This is how you get it. The corporations are actually successful at producing. Communism has the right values. Somehow you have to mash them together. And of course, that this is going to happen through not the working class. Remember, Marcuse said that we don't need the working class anymore. We need a new working class. He actually literally used that phrase, a new working class. We need a new working class, because the actual working class, which we no longer as communists have to care about if we're communists, we don't have to care about the workers anymore because they're stabilized. In fact, they're conservative in many cases and even counter-revolutionary. They like their lives. They like what they can build. So instead of relying on the stupid workers and the stupid peasants, we're going to use the young middle-class intelligentsia, and we're going to use the ghetto populations and identity politics to drive it. And only then are we going to have a withering away. So the first step of a withering away for socialism of the state is going to be a withering away of giving a shit about the worker. Because, baby, there's a lot of power in those corporations and we could sure use it. I said mention graphic and discuss it again. You guys are going to be so happy to have these notes. So capitalism, this is very repetitive, but capitalism is unsustainable and exclusive, so we need sustainable and inclusive capitalism. And I want you to focus on those last two words, inclusive capitalism. Let's mantra it, inclusive capitalism. So just remember that. Socialism's poor production and tends to be bureaucratic, so what we need is productive and even liberated socialism. That's the qualitative change. These are two names. Inclusive or sustainable and inclusive capitalism and productive socialism are two names for the same thing. And I said, I want you to remember the words inclusive capitalism because the Vatican, in conjunction with Lynn Forrester de Rothschild, which seems to be a weird character to lump in with the Pope, have founded a thing called the Council for Inclusive Capitalism. You should look this thing up. It's really horrifying. They also have about 600 CEOs of the top 1,000 companies in the world fully on board. In case you wonder what you have here, you don't now just have a public-private partnership, you have a public-private faith partnership pushing the same values change, which they're calling inclusive capitalism. Remember, we put an adjective in front of the thing, and then the old thing is bad and the new thing is good, and then we drop the adjective eventually, and we just say that's what capitalism always really was. So how in the world is this dialectic in the diagram to be constructed, engaged, and completed? In other words, how are we to trigger the series of lowercase omega points in Teilhard de Chardin's language to get to the omega point of communism in the end, which is the swirly going into the arrow to number 6 in your graphic? Well, capitalism, through the criticisms of Western Marxism particularly, has to be made sustainable and inclusive. So Western Marxism has to restrain and limit the freedom of markets in the West somehow. And meanwhile, actually existing socialism, or aka Eastern Marxism as we called it, has to be made productive somehow or another. So some capitalism has to be let into the communist East. And it turns out that China was in a pretty desperate situation to make a deal after Mao died, and was the perfect candidate in the late 1970s, kind of a decade or so after this theory had been able to come to fruition in a handful of operators and thinkers who might want to put it into action. The USSR being locked in its Cold War struggle with the US made it inadequate for the purpose. In fact, it was the driver saying that we needed the qualitative change. So the USSR was being used by history and then discarded, kind of like the feminists have been used by history and then discarded. Like Hegel said, everybody is used by history and then discarded. So we're going to talk about the Western half of this first, and then we'll go to the Eastern half. We have to put a bridle on capitalism somehow in the West. How are we going to do that? And like I said, Marcuse provides the vision, and his vision is that capitalist production is wasteful and unsustainable, that creates false needs. Those false needs get mistaken for true needs, and then they produce more false needs that get mistaken for new true needs, and you have this cascade of more until the whole thing collapses. That makes people believe that they need to work harder and harder and harder to earn more and more so they can obtain their false needs, things that you don't really need to get along with, which means, in a nutshell, we need a lower standard of living here. There's a name for that, degrowth. Degrowth communism is actually the full name of it, which is, not to open a can of worms that I'm not going to deal with, but this is a neo-Malthusian graft onto Marxist theory. Thomas Malthus believed that we were going to overstrip the resource base of the planet and that there would be a gigantic ecological collapse. Marx happened to call this metabolic rift. He had the same idea, but he hated Thomas Malthus. So he appropriated the idea probably to his own purposes. Marx was anti-Malthusian, but now this is pro-Malthusian. So it's another reason people say, oh, it's not Marxism because blah, 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 whatever. Basically, this thing was cooked up in the 70s, or 60s really, behind the scenes, but it came out in the 70s. It was called the Club of Rome. You can guess where they organized and met. Venice. Just kidding. It was in Rome. But actually, it turns out, I recently learned, I did a podcast on this, I know we have a Canadian here, that Pierre Trudeau, Justin Trudeau's father, actually is the reason that the Club of Rome got off the ground. The guys who organized the Club of Rome, Pecci, for example, went and they had this idea, but they needed some countries to back it. They had money. They had people willing to give them money, but they didn't have any political backing. And Pierre Trudeau thought it would be a great idea. After he got elected in 1968, Pierre Trudeau Mania, they called it, Trudeau Mania, took over the country, and he created all these environmental councils for Canada that didn't exist before. And a bunch of the members of his cabinet ended up as members of the Club of Rome, the founding members. How about that? And it turns out, so Canada, hosers, got the Club of Rome off the ground. You hosers. So this is where we get this degrowth idea, though, is that we have to prevent the proliferation of false needs becoming true needs that people think that they can't live without. Like, I guess you don't really, I was going to grab my cell phone, you don't really need that thing, right? Like, you could live with a lot less, couldn't you? I'm sure those creature comforts that you have, your custom mug that says something cute on it, you don't need that. You could just have a plain one. You don't need anything nice. Right? You don't need, paper cups and everything convenient that you throw away and just make waste. You can figure out how to carry a water bottle around with you everywhere you go all the time and make sure it's made out of metal or something that doesn't pollute the environment. And the whole thing, man, I'm telling you. But this degrowth communism is probably articulated most thoroughly by a Japanese Marxist named Kohei Saito. He claims that he has discovered the true understanding of Marx's latest works in his life, the third volume of Capital, which was never even completely finished. And so Marx had an environmental turn, he claims, at the end of his life, going against Engels' ideas of environmentalism, which we already heard what Lenin and Mao and Stalin did with that, with the conquest of nature, and that the whole point is to avoid the metabolic rift with our inorganic body of nature by making sure we don't overconsume. He was very concerned, Marx allegedly in the third volume of Capital, is very, very concerned with the fact that we grow plants in a farm and we cart off the food that we grow to the city so that the organic material that came out of the ground into the plant goes off somewhere else and doesn't make it back into the soil, for example. Now write that out to the biggest possible scale, and basically nature's going to rupture on us and we're going to find ourselves in a world of hurt. And so Kohei Saito believes that he's figured out what Marx really meant, as like every Marxist ever has, and he builds his vision of a degrowth economy to be more sustainable like that, more inclusive, of course, but primarily, if you read the book and you look for a phrase over and over and over again, around a reduction of the working day. They just don't want jobs, man. They just don't want jobs. Also, that will be balanced off. We're going to work less, but that's okay because we're going to also have a massively reduced standard of living. Now, having a lower standard of living, he argues, with a dead straight face, would increase the well-being of society, hence the transition to a well-being economy. And the well-being economy is meant to produce, or to replace GDP, gross domestic product. So they'll cook up some scam measurement of how well off the people are. Look at how Canada's doing with that. If they're not well enough, I guess MAID will call. And, you know, the net well-being will go up because they get rid of the people who have low well-being. Works, death panels. But we're going to have an abundance of well-being because we don't work as much, is literally the program. We'll just have to have a slightly more austere life. He says, this is Kohei Saito, without the market competition and endless pressure for capital accumulation, freely associated labor and cooperative production could possibly reduce the working day to just 3 to 6 hours. Only then will people have sufficient time for non-consumerist activities such as leisure, exercise, study, and love. You guys don't have time for love because you're too busy working. Sorry, honey, I can't love today. I'm working. In other words, it is possible to reduce the realm of necessity not by increasing the productive forces, but by rehabilitating communal luxury, which means adjusting what you think is good enough, which allows people to live more stably without the pressure of being subjugated to the wage labor system. So, you know, we're going to replace working with non-consumerist activities such as leisure, exercise, study, and love. Now, it turns out that Kohei Saito thinks he's a freaking genius, and he's on the big book tour for not just this book, which was called Marx and the Anthropocene, but his two kind of more pop versions, which are called Slow Down. But Marcuse beat him to that sentiment by 5 decades. So you just heard Kohei Saito say it. Here's exactly what Marcuse said 5 decades ago. Under these circumstances, liberation from the affluent society does not mean return to healthy and robust poverty, moral cleanliness, and simplicity. On the contrary, the elimination of profitable waste would increase the social wealth available for distribution. And at the end of permanent mobilization, would reduce the social need for the denial of satisfactions that are the individual's own. Denials which now find their compensation in the cult of fitness, strength, and regularity. I think Kohei Saito just plagiarized Marcuse. I can't accuse him of that because I don't have proof, but those are very similar sentiments. It's not original. Marcuse laid the degrowth program down and retooled, in fact, evolved Marxist theory completely in this direction that we're dealing with, that I'm calling corporate Marxism. And it's completely caught up on this idea of degrowing our current economy in line with Marcuse's thoughts, which Kohei Saito claims to have rediscovered for himself in Marx's latest writings that nobody was able to discern. So degrowth communism, what is degrowth, by the way? Let's just put it in words on film. Degrowth communism is a death cult. That's what it is. It's the worship of less. It means freezing to death while you starve in the winter. That's what it means. In the dark, actually. It means energy scarcity. It means food scarcity. It means all the problems that caused the majority of the deaths. The majority of the deaths in the Soviet and Chinese context were not murders. They were deaths of lack. They were exposure, they were starvation, and they were disease. So we're going to great leap backwards ourselves into this. Degrowth communism is a death cult, and it is all the rage, and it is what's actually at the heart of the ESG movement that's actually controlling all of this. And what we'll get out of that is commonwealth. Lots more of it. Like when we all live in our tight little 15-minute cities, there'll be lots more nature out there to enjoy that's commonwealth to everybody. You can't go there, but it's out there, and you can see pictures of it from the drones or something. There'll be lots of unspoiled nature. There'll be all the leisure time you want, I guess, for love. I don't know. Marcuse says exercise bad. Saito says exercise good. I don't know which one times change, I suppose, as to what the qualitative change includes. But these are going to be the primary forms of abundant wealth that we have under degrowth communism. Not having to work and having more nature and less social injustice. In other words, you will own nothing and you will be happy. And there's not going to be any half measures on this, by the way, guys. I know that's a Hitler phrase, not a communist phrase, but there's not going to be any half measures. You guys have heard of the Green New Deal or green capitalism, sometimes it's called, or sometimes it's called green growth. That's not allowed. Kohei Saito shatters this dream. He wails on this. In fact, if you've read, and you haven't, most of you haven't, Marx's critique of the Gotha program, what happened was in the Gotha region in Germany, they came up with a socialist program that Marx decided was a half measure. So he writes this critique of the Gotha program to say why it's not actually undergoing the qualitative change and it's still dragging in aspects of capitalist society and it's not doing it right. Well, that's the Green New Deal. Degrowth is the real thing. It's the real communism. The Green New Deal is a half measure pretending. What does that mean in reality? It's a sales pitch. It's how we get started and then they say, oh my gosh, it's not working because it's not enough. We need more. And so green growth is a lie sold to the public to justify degrowth. Another example is that net zero, which we already just heard from Klaus Schwab is going to be forced, right? Is a lie to sell something called absolute zero. And absolute zero means absolutely no emissions, absolutely zero emissions, allegedly by 2050. There's a document put out by the UK FIRES organization, which is a bunch of major universities plus the British government in the UK that came out in 2019 called Absolute Zero. You're more than welcome to look it up. I did a podcast reading a bunch of it out loud, or at least the executive summary part of it. They include that by 2050 there will be no flights, none, no air travel whatsoever, no container shipping at all. Very few cars. Cars will be limited to being extremely lightweight, electric, low or no emission. There will be no new cement produced anywhere in the world. There will be no new steel produced anywhere in the world. It will all have to be recycled. There will be, all shipping will have to be done not by heavy rail, but by light rail. Somehow there's going to be a lot more travel by rail with no new steel. Like, put that together in your head. I asked a metallurgist about this, a steel guy about this at one point, and I'm not an expert in steel. I don't know that much about it. And I said, well, if they recycle all the steel, what do you get? And he said, the best recycled steel, and this, again, qualify, I don't know if this is true, but I'm telling you what he told me. The best recycled steel that we can produce right now is roughly the quality of the best steel they could produce in 1870. So imagine what you can build with this excellent low-quality steel that's always diminishing in quantity, because every time you melt and try to forge steel, you get something called scale on the outside. You get some loss. All of the oxidation gets burned off. It all gets lost. So you have a diminishing supply of lower and lower grade steel. This sounds like what they made by accident in the Great Leap Forward, trying to increase steel production without knowing how, but that we're going to do it on purpose instead in a Great Leap backwards. And I really want to drive home the point that this is the Great Leap backwards. My favorite depiction of the degrowth communist plan comes from the socialist magazine called The Monthly Standard. You are more than encouraged to look this up. Degrowth Monthly Standard, you'll see it. It depicts degrowth in the current economy, of our current economy, with a green spiraling line with little arrows on it showing the direction of the spiral. They love the spirals, right? Well, this isn't an upward spiral. This is a downward spiral to a little red circle in the middle that has little arrows showing the steady state economy in the middle, right? So it's literally a picture of your economy going down the drain. I mean, I looked at it and I was like, that's a picture of a drain. What the heck? And that's the picture for degrowth. So what it suggests is that degrowth communists, or sustainable capitalists, they lie to us and call them, believe they can shrink the economy to the right size and then manage it in perpetuity at that size with few or no new inputs in terms of energy or materials or any of that. And of course, producing absolutely zero emissions. Emissions is the enemy class, by the way. Emissions is the bad word. It's the thing we all have to fight against. It's the enemy. Doesn't matter if it makes sense or not. Like most of the air pollution people deal with when they talk about the air in cities because the cars, it's not actually due to the emissions, it's due to the brake dust, but they don't really point out the real facts of that. It turns out electric cars, because they're heavier, produce more brake dust and microscopic sizes in the air in cities than do gas-powered cars by a factor of a lot. So, yeah, it's all fake. Of course, they'll discover that problem down the line after everybody only has electric cars and say you can't have an electric car either. And then nobody has a car. This is how this works. Marcuse actually explains this model. We don't have to rely on Saito or the monthly standard. He says, a new standard of living adapted to the pacification of existence also presupposes a reduction in the future population. That's in One-Dimensional Man in chapter 9, right there in black and white. And he rails upon why it's an ethical thing to do for a couple pages after that. When he wrote that in 1964, published it in 1964, the world population was about 3.5 billion people, a little less than half of what it is now. Of course, he said, it would presuppose a reduction of the future population. But don't worry, you guys. There aren't that many of us in the West. We're going to have to reduce the population of the backwards people. Here's what he said. This is actually Marcuse also in One-Dimensional Man. Such indigenous progress would demand, he's talking about in the third world, such indigenous progress would demand a planned policy which, instead of superimposing technology on the traditional modes of life and labor, would extend and improve them on their own grounds, eliminating the oppressive and exploitative forces, material and religious, which make them incapable of assuring the development of a human existence. Social revolution, agrarian reform, and reduction of overpopulation would be prerequisites, but not industrialization after the pattern of the advanced societies. So that's the vision that they have for the third world, which they're using as a lever. Communists always hold up things as a lever that they're actually going to destroy, which is reduction of their population, lots of reform of what they're already doing, more using of indigenous methods, but not industrialization. No future for you. So you're going to keep the backwards countries backwards until communism arrives to rescue them. The International Monetary Fund and CCP are more than happy to come build their socialist secured infrastructure for them and turn them into economic debt slaves. How about that? And that's exactly what's happening. Exactly what's happening. Imagine like if you shut down the cruise industry for several years so that all those ships that go and sustain the Caribbean economy don't go there anymore. You know, those strategically placed islands right off the coast of both North and South America, right? So you shut down their entire cruise tourism economy for 4 or 5 years, or for 3 or 4 years, sorry. We're talking, you know, a Super Bowl worth of people coming in every day. That's their economy. You shut that down, oh my God, they're destitute. They're absolutely broke. They're completely backwards. Well, we can't industrialize. We can't keep the cruise ships going because that's the pattern of industrial production in the advanced societies. We have to do something different. Tell you what, we'll cut you a deal with either the CCP or the IMF, and if it's the CCP, of course, they can build bases there. And that's exactly what's happened throughout the Caribbean. You should see how many of them are on Chinese or IMF deals and plans now after COVID collapsed their economies in that extraordinarily geostrategic location right off the coast of the United States. Uh-oh, it's almost like they drew it up. Apparently, degrowth promises increasing immaterial abundance so that you can let go of your commodity abundance. And the people in the West can learn to be able to see what can be unburdened by their standards of living that have been. So the question, of course, now is, that's the how, right? That's the what and the how. Well, not really the how, but that's the what they're doing, is why would anybody do this? And the answer to why actually gets us to how. Well, communists, including today's communists, operate through central control and coercion. They actually operate through creative destruction, like I just described in the Caribbean. They called, of course, the model that runs it democratic centralism, as Lenin and Mao called it. But let's remember what Klaus Schwab actually said. Many businesses do not have an interest in making the world better, and some will be tempted to engage in greenwashing or woke washing, but they'll be forced to commit to ESG. And ultimately, all the commitments will be put to the test by government action and societal pressure. Oh, why would anybody do this? Because they're forced to. That's it. So it isn't why would anybody do this? It's because communists, using a democratic central model that they're calling stakeholder capitalism, are forcing them to do it. And that tells you the how. We know it has, he said it was the ESG right there. That's what we're going to force them to do. So the United Nations is at the heart of this whole program in the West. The United Nations Agenda 2030 codifies the first stages of all of this. I'm not going to give the whole history. There was an Agenda 21. They're supposed to be happening by 2021. They didn't have what they needed to do it, so they kicked it out to 2030. There was originally some Millennium Development Goals, 8 of them that they proposed around the Millennium Assembly around 2000, and that wasn't enough, so they expanded it in 2015 to the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. Isn't it funny that there are 17 Sustainable Development Goals and 17 books in the Corpus Hermeticum, and 17 contradictions of capitalism identified by Marx, and 17 generative themes required by Paulo Freire to conscientize somebody in the process of raising their critical consciousness? It's almost like they care a lot about that magical hermetic number because it's a magical hermetic religion. Well, basically, through the United Nations, major governmental and international incentives exist to participate. All 193 member states of the United Nations are encouraged by, it's not exactly a forceful organization really, encouraged by the United Nations to adopt these standards, and then they pressure each other in order to participate. It's a little uglier in the corporate world, but this is how you get the governments on board. This is why when I talk to somebody in Kenya, they're doing the exact same educational initiatives that we see in the United States. It's because it's coming down from the United Nations and their Sustainable Development Goals. People think that that's a conspiracy theory. I saw its poster in Chicago O'Hare Airport. I've seen its poster painted as a mural on the side of a building in Houston. They have entire websites dedicated to not only the goals, but how they're all going to be achieved, how they're going to be implemented in everything. The little placards on all the stuff. The people wear the little lapel pin that is the Eye of Sauron that actually, not only is it that little lapel pin, anybody who's wearing the wheel of the 17 little colors in the circle that on their lapel wants you to die. They are the bad guys. Who are the they doing this? The people wearing the lapel pin. They're signaling to you who they are. And they coordinate that through the World Economic Forum. Now, granted, I've talked to some folks who've actually been to Davos and checked it out, and they're like, no, it's a big ski party. Well, it's a wheeling and dealing and good. It probably is a big ski party with, prostitutes and cocaine and drinking and backroom deals and making very powerful friends and allies, and everybody's having a good time. And it is a party, and you want to get to go back to the party next year. And of course, there's no pressure to do anything. You're just making deals with all the people you're rubbing elbows with, which happen to be heads of state and heads of the biggest corporations and the wealthiest people and the heads of the nonprofits all get to come and have their big party where they all get together and bond and cook up things. And it all works according to Chatham House rules. So you can say what happened, but you can't say who said it all the time. And they all want to go back to their ski party every year. And if they want to go back to their big ski party every year, they can't make the people who invite you to the ski party mad. So you don't criticize the agendas. You don't criticize the people putting the agendas into place, or you don't get to go next year. In other words, one of the things they're leveraging to ruin the world and transform the world is FOMO, fear of missing out, on the Davos party. And there they make big public-private partnership deals. Governments suggest, hey, we could do regulation stuff this way or whatever, and you guys could bring a product to market that's going to fit right in this, make a ton of money, and you can get all the kind of crony public-private partner deals that start to happen between government officials, corporate executives, and non-governmental organizations, NGOs, coordinating. But I haven't answered the question of why would anybody do this, or I guess how it's to be done, except to say that it's going to be forced. And the UN isn't really strong enough to force it. They just kind of coerce and guide and direct and recommend. How do you do it? ESG. The ESG requirements are actually the tool that they're using to do it. It is the force. That's exactly what Klaus Schwab said they're going to use. They're going to force corporations to do ESG. And the Sustainable Development Goals of Agenda 2030 are all supported by the ESG initiative, and the ESG initiative can be contoured to support them. ESG stands for Environmental, Social, and Governance Scoring for Forcing Corporate Behavior. Larry Fink said that corporations need to be forced. That's what he said, that's what we're doing. He said, markets like totalitarian systems, we are forcing behaviors. Larry Fink, the CEO of BlackRock and an executive partner of the World Economic Forum, said we are forcing behaviors on purpose because markets like totalitarian governments is what he said. Where did ESG come from? It was invented at the UN in 2003, as a matter of fact, by an intern named James Gifford, who was trying to figure out how to leverage pension money, all of those long-term passive investments, At the time, it was about $6 trillion. It's over, I think, $10 or $11 trillion now. How do you leverage all that passive money to do what's called impact investing, activist investing, to make a change in the world? James Gifford was motivated, if I've read right about him, primarily in forest preservation, which is the E. They quickly looped in the idea of the corporate social responsibility fad that the consultants were pushing, which is S. And then they networked in with the big management consulting firms like McKinsey, Deloitte, Boston Consulting, Booz Allen Hamilton, and the others to come up with a governance. What are the good practices of government or corporate governance, which they reinvent every few years and go sell to the corporations, and you get the G score. The pretext or the rationale, maybe it was a legit rationale for this, was these are long-term investments of large amounts of money, so we want to know what's going to work over the long term, not boom and bust cycles in the short term, in the volatility of the market. So how can we predict long-term performance, 30-year performance of a stock, instead of, short-term performance, which is about all we have a good window on? And they said, well, companies that are bad at the environment, bad at social responsibility will get punished, and corporations that have bad management policies will also not succeed in the long term. So if they have good E, good S, and good G, they're probably more likely to be winners in the long term. That justified their existence. That's the rationale for their existence. I don't know if they actually ever meant it. 2003 was a long time ago. The S didn't even go woke really until 2008 to 2012, and none of this really got off the ground codified and becoming a real problem until 2015 when Obama changed the investment laws to allow it to be a problem. But that was the rationale. It turns out, though, anything you can measure, you can game. So if they say, well, we're going to see how good your environmental policy is, your social policy, and your governance policy, and then we're going to determine a score of how good your company is for listing it in our different, indices or whatever, stock indices. Well, then all of a sudden the companies can start pretending to try to meet those scores and whatever, and they can condition what the scores are based on how they want to force the behavior of the corporation. So I used to say, how do you control the bull on Wall Street? Is you put a ring through its nose. And so here's the ring. Oh my God, the corporations will chase these numbers if the metrics mean something to their bottom line. And so they put a ring through, and it's not a little girl fiercely standing in defiance of a bull, which is just a perfect statue of feminist over-belief in their own capabilities. Delusion, actually. In fact, it's actually that there's a ring through the bull's nose being pulled along because they realize that these corporate finance guys will chase these metrics in order to raise the score. And so then, oh my God, we have a means, they'll chase the metrics. What if we controlled what the metrics measure? What if we change what the S score looks like I already told you about? So ESG works by controlling the detached capital of most corporations. This is trillions and trillions of dollars, which is an immense amount of power. Why would anybody do this? Because there are trillions of dollars involved. Something like 40% of the entire S&P 500 is proxy owned by the top 2 or 3 or 4 of these asset management firms that push ESG. That's a lot of power. BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street are BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street are the top 3. And I think it's just those 3, don't quote me exactly on this, control something like 40% of not any given company, of the S&P 500. And all of that's backed by 2 things we don't talk nearly enough about in all of our rage against those entities, which are ISS and Glass Lewis. So I'm not going to get into that, but I'm glad I said it. So that gives them lots of very powerful levers of control, and that allows them to jerk around and control the corporations. And who's going to decide what ESG looks like? The stakeholders. And where did we get this word stakeholder all over business? From this invention in the late 1960s and early 1970s of stakeholder capitalism, which was allegedly coined by Klaus Schwab. And his first book is titled Stakeholder Capitalism. Allegedly, he borrowed that idea, to say it politely, from Henry Kissinger, who was his mentor at Harvard. So here's how you set up the Soviet. The stakeholder Soviets control what ESG scoring looks like, and they can pull the corporations around to do their bidding. And if they really want to go to their ski party, or they really want to be included in the deals and the direction of the future economy, then they have to join things like a Council for Inclusive Capitalism that's lining it all out. In other words, they've reinvented the vanguard, but in corporate power. The corporate vanguard is now paired with the youth vanguard to put the squeeze on society, top down, bottom up, inside out. And they democratically, amongst themselves, not involving you as a stakeholder, decide how corporations are run using ESG to support the SDGs or any other arbitrary decision that they decide later on to be, because they are now the real corporate vanguard class who has the real stake in production, and we will own nothing and be happy. I like how one of them at the World Economic Forum, associated, not at the World Economic Forum, not at Davos, one of the guys they were interviewing is one of these big players. I forget, he's the CEO of one of these companies in Europe. He actually said that, why would we sell you the product if all you want is the benefit of the product? So we'll sell you the benefit of the product and we'll retain ownership of the product. In other words, everything will become a lease model or a subscription model or a streaming model, and you won't own anything. That's how you will own nothing and be happy model is supposed to work. But it's all going to be decided in terms of how it works by the stakeholder councils or the stakeholder Soviet, just like the workers' councils in Soviet Union. So we're actually dealing with kind of Leninism 2.0, which a great moment in the video when we put this out will be that there's a picture of Klaus Schwab sitting in his office with a bust of Lenin on his bookcase behind him, as though maybe that's an inspiring thing to have in your office. So the degrowth and much of the sustainable development agendas are primarily contained in the E part of ESG, environmental. The G in ESG is an enforced corporate politburo that makes sure that corporations are run by compliant leaders, that is, commissars, with compliant policies. And they reward themselves for hiring more of those people and implementing the programs, and they punish themselves if they don't, which is self-criticism on the corporate level. The S in ESG is another Leninist, Stalinist, that is, Soviet project called DEI. You've probably never heard that described as a Leninist project. DEI. Where did DEI come from? This is embarrassing for me. Mea culpa. I gave a very long workshop in Miami a couple of years called The Marxist Roots of DEI, and I never mentioned that it actually came straight from Lenin, because I didn't know yet. Well, DEI is obviously the practical manifestation of the woke in institutional spaces. It hides behind veneers of nice things like civil rights, particularly behind affirmative action, which is an equity program. Well, what is it really? So diversity, I already told you it's diverse to the prevailing hegemony. So it's diverse to the prevailing values, diverse to the existing environment, that is, it's the counter-hegemonic values. What does diversity do in practice? It politicizes any environment that takes it up as a value. Inclusion. Inclusion means to accommodate the ideology of the counter-hegemony. So include views that are outside of the prevailing corporate, institutional, or even societal value system. It forces ideological accommodationism, therefore, and thus transformation. This place isn't a place where women feel comfortable because I'm a mad feminist, and that means you don't value women. So you have to change all the policies to make not women feel comfortable, but to make an irascible feminist feel comfortable. So you have to now accommodate ideology. This is what happens when you blend ideology and identity into a single thing, which is what all the woke identity politics do. They can become irreconcilable or irascible people. You can't satisfy them. And then they say, well, this is a place that's unsafe. It causes harm for women and minorities. And we all know that I made a stupid white girl voice for that because it's often done by proxy by some nice little cadre as opposed to somebody who's actually a token class, right, as in our language. It blends politics with identity in order to accomplish its goals. That's how inclusion works. And it justifies censorships and purges. The liberating tolerance model or the Maoist anti-campaigns should come to mind. Equity, definition, an administered system in which shares are adjusted to make participants equal. An administered system in which shares are adjusted to make participants equal. That's the definition of socialism, but it's also the definition of equity. Isn't that funny? Like I said, this has all kind of come in hiding behind civil rights law, and it does so, if you want something actionable to go after, through the communist doctrine of civil rights law called disparate impact. If there is a disparate impact in group averages, then there might be discrimination happening even if nobody can find it. That was codified into civil rights law practice by a Supreme Court case in 1971 called Griggs versus Duke Power. I assure you, if the Supreme Court ends up hearing a case and overrules Griggs versus Duke Power, you're going to watch the left fall on its knees and scream like Trump got elected every day for the next 1,000 years. But like I told you the other night, there's no such thing as an equitable protection clause of the 14th Amendment, so this is a bogus communist legal doctrine. It is an equal protection clause, which should be blind to the identities that it protects. Leftists got here. How did they do that? They became civil rights attorneys and conservatives didn't. That's it. Basically the whole thing. You get critical legal studies, feminist legal studies, and critical race theory right out of the fact that they were absolutely dedicated to figuring out how to give themselves legal advantages in basically every institutional setting. But this is actually a project I told you that came from Lenin and Stalin from the early 1920s in the USSR. So Stalin, although you can find it in Lenin as well, writing in 1923 in what's called the National Factors in Party and State Affairs, wrote, or maybe it was a speech, I don't know, I read it, so for me he wrote, "The 10th Congress of our party already pointed out that the abolition of actual national inequality," so actual equality is the concept that's being ushered in there, and that's what I want you to pay attention to because we call that equity today. "The abolition of actual national inequality is a lengthy process involving a stubborn and persistent struggle against all survivals of national oppression and colonial slavery." Sounds like CRT in post-colonial theory. "But to overcome it, it is absolutely necessary. And it can be overcome only by the Russian proletariat rendering the backwards peoples, the ghetto populations, of the Union real and prolonged assistance in their economic and cultural advancement." So they're going to give them affirmative action programs and they're going to give them cultural assistance to bring them into being socialists through their ethnic identities. Otherwise, there can be no grounds for expecting the establishment of a proper and durable cooperation of the peoples within the framework of a single union state. Hence, the second immediate task of our party lies in the struggle to abolish the actual inequality of the nationalities, the struggle to raise the cultural and economic level of the backwards peoples. So that was Stalin on this, and I have a friend, Stephen Williver, who actually laid this out and explained it because he can read Russian and I can't, and studies these people and has much longer than I have. And what we call equity, they called actual equality. I am going to attempt and butcher some Russian in front of you, and I apologize for how that goes. Maybe we'll cover that up in the video with Google Translate or something. So diversity, if you were to go on Google Translate right now and type in diversity and translate it to Russian, is a word, here we go, разнообразие. I think I did that right. Unity of socialist content through diversity of folkish identity form is what it meant for Marxists. If I didn't say it right, don't correct me. Just let it be. Let it fly. This is white boy from Tennessee Russian. So diversity was actually, by exactly the same word, diversity, a program, and it was to create unity of socialist content through looking at the different folk identities of Russia and bringing socialism to them to unify them under one new banner. Mao did the exact same thing with the 55 minority races. Equity is what they called actual equality. Oh my God. Fatichesko ravенство. We'll just pretend that I did that right. So that is, this is my friend Stephen giving us what this is, actual racial, economic, and cultural equality achieved through inequality of the oppressor. So economic equality being achieved through the Soviet pressure wasn't enough. You've also got to get cultural equality. That makes actual equality when you have both economic and cultural equality. But that's equity. That's what we're doing. We've extended the idea of socialism from the economic realm also into the cultural realm, but that was a program of the Soviet Union. As early as the early 1920s, that was taken as the second most important program of their party. And then inclusion, korenitsaya, something, I did that way wrong. Taking root or indigenization is how that literally translates. But what it is of course, is a communist inversion. They were going to indigenize the people, the backwards peoples, into communism. So he defined it as the eradication of otherness, and that's in quotes, the inclusion of minorities, women, etc., in party literacy, government positions, jobs, and education, and socialist constructions of the ethnic group. Our DEI program came straight from Lenin and Stalin in the early 1920s, and it was considered the second highest priority of the Soviet Union's party apparatus. Where did it come from? Soviet Russia. So that's Western corporate Marxism. That's what's going on our side and why it's going on our side. They're forcing it through this truly top-down, falsely bottom-up, and sort of inside-out, that's also fabricated, transformation of our society. But that's why our Marxism is corporately run into sustainable and inclusive capitalism. It is run by a corporate cartel that is headed up by oligarchs who call themselves stakeholder representatives and form a stakeholder Soviet that they lie to us and call stakeholder capitalism. Why capitalism? Because the oligarchs get to make lots of money. But they do so in public-private partnership, that is fascism, with the government and the coordinating nonprofits. And so how in the world were they able to penetrate all those cabinets and all of the corporate boards and so on? Good thing INGSOC, good thing our Fabians have been infiltrating everything for so long. But then Klaus Schwab directly said, we're going to penetrate the cabinets. And then he has, especially he was talking about Canada, I think. But there's the other half of this dialectic now to talk about, which is a productive Eastern corporate communism to match our Western corporate communism. And there was a perfect place to do this experiment, the CCP after Mao. Mao was a bad dude. China was in absolute destruction and disarray after he died in 1976. They were desperate for a change, and the change that they had was brought to them by some characters we already had. But I just want to make one point real quick before I get into the details of the Eastern side, is that we here in the West are not getting put through a Maoist cultural revolution, which we are being put through. Undoubtedly, what's happening is a Maoist cultural revolution to our culture with corporate Hunger Games run by ESG, and I mean that literally is the way the corporate games operates. The ones who play ball the best get to survive and become the oligarchs, and everybody else is going to get consumed. They're going to get literally bought up or driven out of business in giant multinational partnerships. We're not being put through a Maoist revolution in order to get a Maoist regime. People ask, who's the Mao? What's it look like? We're not doing that. We're being put through a Maoist cultural revolution to get what China got after Mao left, or died, really. We're going through Mao to get to Deng. And that's a kind of a cognate pun here in English. I'm trying to train myself to say his name closer to correct, which is Deng Xiaoping, not Deng Xiaoping. But Deng Xiaoping is actually the relevant character that transformed China in the East. Mao broke it and then build back better. I believe that was the question the other night. So that's Deng Xiaoping's role, is build back better. So I wrote in my notes, because I'm funny, in 1976, Mao made his greatest contribution to humanity. He died. But if things were so bad and so tumultuous that it took him 2 years to figure out who was going to lead China in his place, and there was huge rival factions between his various leaders as to who was going to take over. Liu Shaoqi was already on the outs, but his other big leaders were kind of still on the in. But it turns out that Deng Xiaoping, who had been with him from very early on in CCP days, way before the Chinese Revolution in 1949, took the place. In 1978, he became the chairman of CCP. Mao's longtime comrade, and he inherited a complete disaster. He got exactly the kind of China Mao Zedong would leave behind. Total economic disarray, utter economic collapse, rampant abject poverty, starvation, the worst of economic conditions basically anywhere in the world. You could say, they said that, the capitalist countries were the first world and the socialist countries were the second world, and then you had the undeveloped countries that were the third world. Well, China basically went to the fourth world by the destruction of Mao in some sense. I think that's a real term. I was just making a joke. Nobody laughed, so it wasn't funny. We'll go back to Schwabwarts. Everybody thought Schwabwarts was good. But Deng Xiaoping was a pragmatist. He was more pragmatic than most Marxists. His most famous utterance, perhaps, is, "I don't care if a cat is black or white as long as it catches mice." And what he was talking about was not cats. It turns out he was making a metaphor. He was talking about the economy of China. How are we going to get China back on its feet? And he decided we can allow a corporate hybrid model to come in. We can start to allow people to produce. He called it one country, two systems. So there'd be one country, China, the PRC actually, People's Republic of China, that would have two systems, both socialist and capitalist, operating at the same time. He also said that the reason he would do this was because of an old Chinese saying that he was twisting to his own purposes, which is seek truth from facts. In other words, be pragmatic and try to be realistic about your situation. In other words, we're going to be a lot less ideological in our pursuit of communism. And the belief was that Mao was right on 7 fingers, but he was too ideological on 3. So we're going to wheel back a little bit on how ideologically strict we're going to be for the glory of communism. But he said this was actually all going to be done explicitly for the glory of socialism, not just in China, but throughout the world. So the religion wasn't being abandoned, it was just being updated, and we call this Dengism, or Dungism, I suppose, or Deng Xiaoping theory, or the names for it. He didn't bury Mao the way that Khrushchev buried Stalin. Like I said, he said right on 7 fingers, wrong on 3. But he set out to make a socialism with Chinese characteristics that was actually going to be the model for the New World Order, and in fact, not just the model, that's beta test to see if it would actually work. And so it was going to be an experiment in the productive socialism that Marcuse had recognized a need for, and basically they imported some elements of National Socialist production into the Chinese CCP economy. So what's Deng Xiaoping theory? The government owns the land and it owns the raw materials, but private interests own the companies that do things with them. Therefore, they're not really bourgeois because nobody owns any land, which would be land holding, that's bourgeois, right? But you don't have any of the raw materials, but you get to make whatever you want as long as the government owns all the raw materials in the property that you build it with. So you end up with what they called, and here's an oxymoron for you, a socialist market economy, which would be productive socialism or a socialist capitalism or a capitalist socialism, whatever you want. He claims, although I think it's only 3, Deng Xiaoping claimed to uphold the 4 principles of Chinese communism, but he only upheld 3. The third one, or the last one, is just an honorific. There's no evidence whatsoever that it's true. 1, the basic spirit of communism is to be upheld. So the religious aspiration and mode of belief are still there. 2, the dictatorship of the proletariat in the People's Republic of China is to be there. So the PRC is still a dictatorship over the country. The leadership of the Communist Party as such as the 3rd. And the 4th, which is not actually adhered to, is Marxism, Leninism, and Mao Zedong thought will be preserved. And they are not. Actually, there's no evidence whatsoever. They just say that so that they aren't dissing Mao, because that would be really, really insulting. But all of it is an extension of the Marxist-Leninist theory of what they called theory of productive forces. That we have to make just what Marcuse said, you have to produce in order to have stuff in order to run your country. And if you don't develop the productive forces enough, you can't actually attain socialism because you won't have enough to give to everybody, and you're going to have a problem. And so achieving communism still is the goal, but you avoid the ideological dogmatism, allegedly, in Deng Xiaoping theory by being willing to adapt and run 2 systems in one country. His kind of motto he ran around and said everywhere, Deng Xiaoping went around the country and said, was open up. Open up, open up, open your mind, open up, let new things happen, right? Just not to the students in Tiananmen Square in 1989. Don't open up that far. So how did Deng Xiaoping come up with this let's let the corporations in model, and how in the world did the corporations decide, hey, let's go into the Chinese broken poverty, there's no market there, nobody has any money. How in the world did they decide to do this? How did the corporations get involved in this? What did the Chinese have where they had nothing? Cheap labor, aka slaves. Lots of it. And so we have a couple of intrepid Americans, Henry Kissinger and David Rockefeller, who visited first with Mao before he died, but later with Deng when he took over, and suggested that China could become the production basis for the world. They could be the factory that builds all the things the world needs. They've already proved that they can mobilize people to make things. Of course, that also proved that they tend to force people to make things under conditions that lead to vastly inferior goods, but that's okay. There was also collaboration with the World Economic Forum. Klaus Schwab brags in this weird little book he wrote called The World Economic Forum, The First 40 Years, that he published in 2011, that within the first year of Deng Xiaoping taking power, he was already trying to get Deng Xiaoping to come speak in Davos, and that he refused. So instead, they would send a Chinese delegation, and they would set up a second meeting in the summer of the World Economic Forum, would meet in China somewhere instead. So there was already working with at the time it was called the European Management Forum, directly So Klaus Schwab was in direct cahoots with the CCP in the late 1970s and into the 80s already. And like I said, they were looking around for a model that could work to increase their productive forces, and they quite literally landed on the Nazi model. The National Socialist model seemed to work, and they established what we might call a communo-fascist state, one country, two systems, which is a dialectical synthesis of communism and economic fascism. They certainly are not like the religious fascists where Mussolini was talking about. Why was China chosen as the beta model? Well, there's already a communist government installed that could mobilize people through a command economy. There was the absolute desperation of the Chinese system. There is the pragmatism shown by Deng Xiaoping, which is also savvy long-term planning against the rest of the world, especially the West. Imagine if you were going to become the manufacturing base for the whole world and nobody else is manufacturing everything and they're just consumer economies. We call that having them by the balls. There's a major profit motive on the other side. American corporations could build the biggest consumer market in the world and have cheap manufacturing at the same time. So the offshoring to China would be the cheapest in the world, and we would end up creating wealth there that would create the giant 1.5 billion person consumer market that now controls the behavior of everybody who wants to participate in selling airplanes or basketball tickets. I mean, I didn't say LeBron James' name or anything here, in the Chinese market. And they, again, like I said, this is called being had by the balls. But for Kissinger, I mean, Rockefeller has his own motivations at least, but for Kissinger, this is a massive power move for the State Department and for the Council for Foreign Relations and their buddies at the Asia Society and the Chatham House and the CCP. So there's your theys, by the way, that I was asked about in the question and answer before. But what's in it for China? A functioning economy again. Prestige on the world stage, a strategic advantage of being the world's manufacturing base and largest consumer economy after a couple decades. That gives them massive leverage over the world's corporations and leaders. A platform from which they can bring socialism with Chinese characteristics to other parts of the world, or at least demand adherence if you want to get past the great Chinese business firewall and participate in their market. That would allow them to advance communism in its basic spirit throughout the world, which has always been their goal. They were promised a forthcoming Asian century of global economic dominance in this deal. So there was the British century in the 19th, and then there was the American century in the 20th, and now it's time for Asia to have its century. You will be the global hegemon. You will be the wealthiest country. But that creates a problem. That creates a problem that is called the trap of Thucydides' trap. You see, if we build China, or as China is allowed to grow like this, and we help China grow like this, it becomes a rising and rival power. If we're going to have an Asian century, it must become a rising rival power that will actually overthrow global hegemony at some point. Well, how in the world is that going to happen? Well, Thucydides' trap is a reference back to the Peloponnesian War, where you had Athens and Sparta. And Athens is the existing power and Sparta's rising. And the claim is that when you have a rising power, it will eventually get strong enough to challenge the existing power for regional, or in this case, global dominance. So as China grows, we have a rising rival that's going to eventually, has been promised the possibility of taking control, having an Asian century. So you're going to have war. The Americans in the West aren't just going to give up their standing in the world, but the Chinese are going to want it. The only solution is war, and both countries have nuclear weapons. So that's a bad deal. Now we're in the trap of Thucydides' trap. We're going to build up China because we're greedy and it's a power move, but now we have this war looming. What are we going to do? How do you avoid it? Well, imagine if you degrow the West so that it's too weak and too small and too poor to fight adequately when the war shows up. Well, that would avoid the war. The West would just say, oh my gosh, we can't fight this war. We'll lose. We'll see millions and millions of our people die, and for nothing, and we'll destroy our economy. Here, just take the torch and run with it. And this little plan was largely orchestrated by Henry Kissinger and our State Department with their buddies at the Asia Society, the Council for Foreign Relations. Likely the Chatham House was involved. These are the they. Who are they? Not the Jews. These are the they. Okay, so how's this new model supposed to work, like in practice? Not this big picture stuff like the forcing the ESG thing. So we got these two people, I was going to say two people, but it turns out there's two people that wrote one book and then there's another book. So there's these two ideas. One is George Soros's method, and then there's Cass Sunstein and Richard Thaler wrote a book about nudge theory in a little over a decade and a half ago. And these are the most responsible characters for the method of implementation for this. The excuse for implementation is primarily climate change, which is now morphed at the World Economic Forum to the polycrisis. So it's a crisis, not just climate crisis, it's a polycrisis. It's a crisis in every direction, so give us global power. And these are the mechanism of action. Of course, we've got the stupid Marcusian radical left here undermining everything and somehow weirdly aligning with banks and corporations at the same time because they're so power hungry. And the infiltration of not just the Democratic Party almost completely, but also much of the Republican Party and that kind of Fabian dialectical become your opposition way. And then there's also going to be the model of opt-in tyranny, like I said. So let's talk about nudge theory real briefly. I'm going to not call it nudge theory. I want to call it nudge totalitarianism because that's what they're going to use it for. Sunstein and Thaler wrote this idea that's supposed to be behavioral economics or economic psychology, where what we're going to do now is we're not going to force people to do stuff. We're just going to give them prompts or nudges that lead them to make the right choices all the time. Right? This is why it's opt-in. We're going to put the thing in front of you. You don't have to pick the thing. It's just in front of you. It's the most obvious choice. So just take it. We're going to nudge you to do the right thing. In other words, as this becomes increasingly totalitarian, we're going to make it less and less comfortable to do the wrong thing and more comfortable to do the right thing. But I'll get back to that. So he says, this is they say, Sunstein and Thaler say, a nudge, as we will use the term, is any aspect of the choice architecture that alters people's behavior in a predictable way without forbidding any options or significantly changing their economic incentives. To count as a mere nudge, the intervention must be easy and cheap to avoid. Nudges are not mandates. Putting fruit at eye level counts as a nudge. Banning junk food does not. So that's the thing we're dealing with. But they have this really horrifying part that they talk about, which is called algorithmic nudging. Now, I'm not going to quote from them about algorithmic nudging, which is what we experience on social media and in Google every day. The algorithm is going to constantly nudge us. Imagine as it gets better and better and better at that. But here's a Harvard Business Review had to say about algorithmic nudging. Companies are increasingly using algorithms to manage and control individuals not by force, but rather by nudging them into desirable behavior. In other words, learning from their personalized data and altering their choices in some subtle way. So why do they have to gather your data? We talked in the Q&A last night about why it is with my phone that I can take a picture and I own the data, but if I type my metadata, if I go to the websites, they can record everywhere that I've gone and all the different things I bought and all that, and they get to keep that data. Why isn't that my data? Because they need to learn from the personalized data in order to create the algorithm that can nudge me to do the behaviors that they want me to do, which is what Ben Williamson, actually a leftist critic of all this, calls a psychocracy, a government through psychological manipulation. So when this is going to be controlled by, say, ESG, or it's controlled by access to the People's Republic of China market, it might look like it's organic, just people making decisions, but it's actually very much not. It's very much contoured. So this is what the model of the future looks like. Just imagine a perfectly smart algorithm, 2 or 3 generations down, that can predict exactly what advertisement it has to show you to get you to buy whatever. Or they can predict exactly which messaging needs to show up in your social media feed so that you de-radicalize and go vote for the political party that they want you to vote for. That's the idea of algorithmic nudging. And in fact, it's beyond that. It's to the point of Marcuse's pre-censorship, to where the algorithm actually won't even show you information that it doesn't want you to have. Luckily, they're implementing it with such low sophistication right now that we're actually able to see it. But with higher sophistication, it may very easily become invisible. And then we don't even know what's happening. And their entire information environment, is nudging us to do whatever they want. Okay, what's Soros? What's his relevance? Reflexivity is the new dialectical method. It's the evolution of the dialectic into the practical that we have now. I'm not going to get into a lot of history with him, but he actually brought this method to China in the 1980s when he was still friendly with China and showed them, and the Chinese, the CCP, loved it so much that they adopted reflexivity as the way to transcend Marxism-Leninism and move forward into a new version of the dialectic to transform society. And then later, he and China had a big falling out because Soros believes in this wackadoo, hippy-dippy utopian concept called an open society that can't quite exist, and China is definitely not an open society. And then he realized that they can use his method better than he can, and he freaked out and he started going after them, and they declared him on Twitter actually a couple of years ago, word for word, a demon and an international terrorist. So he's not friendly with China anymore. That's a little complicated for them. So reflexivity, he describes, his method, he describes as operating in the space between what is actually true and what people perceive to be true. Notice the usefulness of social reification from Lukács. If you can make people believe something not quite true, that's okay, they'll act on it. Kind of the quintessential example is a bank run. You believe the bank is going to fail, so you go take out all your money, and a bunch of people do that, so then the bank fails. So the bank wasn't going to fail until a bunch of people believed it was, and then they went and took out all their money, and then it made the bank fail. So it's kind of this principle of becoming based on misunderstanding reality. And actually, Soros is extremely clear that it's about the misunderstanding of reality that moves history. And he says, in fact, it's the place where all historical change takes place, and he calls the magic formula, the magic sauce, fertile fallacies, which is a kind of funny word. So they're errors that are productive in the world. And so this is Soros's theory of change, and here's how he describes it. The historical process, as I see it, is open-ended. So that's why he disagrees with China. Its main driving force is the participant's bias. To be sure, it is not the only force at work, but it is a force that is unique to the historical process and sets it apart from the processes studied by natural science. Biological evolution is attributed to genetic mutation. I contend that historical processes are shaped by the misconceptions of their participants. I would even go so far as to say that the ideas that make history consist of fertile fallacies. A fertile fallacy is originally conceived as an insight. Only when it is translated into reality do its shortcomings become apparent, then begets another fertile fallacy that is antithetical to it, and so it goes. Each fallacy provides a new experience, and to the extent that people learn from experience, the process can be described as progress. Fallacy is, of course, too strong a word, but it is helpful in directing attention in the right direction to the participant's bias. Okay, so let me just cut a cut. Where did Soros, did he come up with this? Is Soros some kind of mad super genius? Well, it turns out he's actually a very smart man, or he was. He's very old. I don't think he's doing as well as he was, but very brilliant man. But no, he didn't come up with this. This is Hegel. This is pure Hegel. You just heard what he said, right? You have an idea, it's actually a misconception, but you put it into practice, then you see why it doesn't work, and then you adjust and do it again. And it's negative, its antithesis shows up from trying it out, right? Okay, so Hegel's philosophy, not to go deep into this, is that there's the absolute idea that is God. Men approximate that in the theoretical idea. I actually mentioned this the other night. And that the theoretical idea is a guess as to what the correct absolute idea is, but it's not. So then they put the theoretical idea into practice. That's called the practical idea. And then they see the error, the distance between the theoretical idea and the absolute idea, and the fact that the practical idea doesn't manifest what they think it's going to make. So it doesn't actually work, which causes people to realize there's a mistake, and they start to work it out in conflict, and then you have a revolution in the theoretical idea that's supposed to better approximate the absolute idea, and the dialectic churns another round around the spiral. It's literally the same thing in plainer language written in 1992 that people can actually read, instead of written in something like 1807 in Hegel speak, which nobody can read. But Soros knows that this is Hegel, by the way. Soros knows what he's saying. Here's what else he says. When a situation has thinking participants, this is the part. Okay, sorry. When a situation has thinking participants, the sequence of events does not lead directly from one set of facts to the next. Rather, it connects facts to perceptions and perceptions to facts in a shoelace pattern. Thus, the concept of reflexivity yields a shoelace theory of history. It must be recognized that the shoelace theory is a kind of dialectic. It can be integrated as a synthesis of Hegel's dialectic of ideas and Marx's dialectical materialism. He knows what he's doing. He's not ignorant of the theories that he's actually putting into play here. He says instead of either thoughts or material conditions evolving in dialectic fashion on their own, it is the interplay between the two that produces a dialectic process. The only reason I do not use the word more prominently is that I do not want to be burdened by the excess luggage that comes with it. I find Hegel obscure, and Marx propounded a deterministic theory of history that is diametrically opposed to my own view, which is this one. So he says history is open-ended. Marx says that it follows this line, but Hegel's obscure, but he doesn't want to be burdened by the baggage that comes with it. In other words, he's going to admit that he's doing it, but he doesn't really want people to realize that reflexivity is just the dialectic repackaged in a more modern and practical form, and specifically applied to financial markets specifically. So here's how it actually works. People are nudged to believe certain things about the world that turn out to not quite be right, either through their own guesses about reality, which are as best they could do but wrong, or through maybe images that are given to them about how a savvy operator would want them to believe the world is. In other words, that they're given misinformation to misbelieve how things work. This causes a chaotic environment as things start to break down. In a chaotic environment, there's a feedback loop of people desperately searching for answers. And in that desperately searching for answers, you can lay down, Soros says, guideposts that they will follow in their desperation in order to make that come about. So agitprop basically is how it actually works if you're going to use it as a weapon, right? It's just a little bit more subtle, and that's why you say hello Ingsoc yet again, right? The Fabians. Guess where Soros was educated? The London School of Economics. So it's a 21st century dialectical tool, not an old Marxist-Leninist dialectical tool, but it's the same beliefs, the same transformative faith, and the same religious program. It's just a new, slightly modified method that mixes Marx and Hegel in a new way. So let's give some kind of concrete examples of how it works. Let's consider, so one of the things that Soros says he likes to do, he actually says he takes a malicious pleasure at it in The Alchemy of Finance, is to short sell an institutional favorite. So how would you short sell a favorite, something that's a clear winner in the stock market? Let's talk about Boeing. So let's say that you have a company, and let's say that it's a big institutional favorite, and then there's some issues that come up. So you start with a plausible story people believe about a real issue, and then what you do is you start a campaign of overtelling every single minor problem story that you can find. So you have a door blow off, real problem that comes up. And then you're like, cracked windshield, somebody had diarrhea and flooded the toilet, so the plane had to land. A tire popped, or routine maintenance, but it delayed people 6 hours. And you tell every story. Now you can't, Soros isn't publishing the stories, but he can pay journalistic outlets and suggest to them that maybe they should tell lots and lots and lots of stories about how Boeing is having all these troubles. Find any story you can about Boeing. Boeing's hot. And you don't have to be weird about it. Boeing's hot right now. It's going to get clicks. Let's go. And you can weaponize the click economy to tell every minor story to create a pervasive misperception that Boeing is doing. It has some real problems, but it's doing way worse than it actually is doing. And then you wait for some other actual real event to come and precipitate a belief that this calamity is at a crisis point. All of a sudden, there's doubt all over the place, a chaotic environment. The doubt in the company becomes reified. And so now you have a company that's performing at whatever level that used to have a belief level, and you've dropped people's belief level in it tremendously. And now what do you have? An overvalued institutional favorite. So that's when you plug in the short sell, and then you wait for something bad to happen. And when the bad thing happens, boom, all of a sudden the real value matches the new perceived value, and you crash them. You do this in cycles over and over and over and over again until you create enough doubt in the thing so that it's actually overvalued compared to the people who are interested in possibly owning shares of it in the economic market. Now let's repeat this with a different institutional favorite. Western civilization and the United States of America. Maybe you would use your vast resources to fund certain things like schools and media that sow doubt in the value of our past and American values. They were all slavers. They were all this. It was so much oppression. Maybe you would use that in schools, particularly to turn kids against their nation, their faith, and to just kind of rot out belief in the USA and Western civilization. Oh, it was colonial. Oh, it was oppressive. It was not that good. It's not worth saving. Maybe you would fill the nation with immigrants to dilute and confuse national identity while adding heaps and heaps of stress to the environment that creates a conflict between the immigrants and the native population. Maybe you would push provocative and divisive identity politics to fracture national identity even further and make people think in terms of their folkish identity characteristics while, again, adding stress. Maybe you would fund prosecutors to get put in place to increase and allow crime, because that turns American cities into shitholes where people are like, this place sucks. America used to be great. Chicago used to be great. Now it's dangerous and it sucks. Maybe you would do work to defund the police and install weak policing, two-tier policing. Again, the Soros DAs that are funded to be there to dismiss, to apply repressive tolerance or liberating tolerance, literally, and not prosecuting leftist crime and prosecuting conservatives for so much as showing up and saying it's no good, until people lose faith in their communities and their country, especially in the youth. So what are some of Soros's biggest funding actions through his Open Society Foundation and other organizations that are subsidiary to? Oh, all of those things. So maybe you could bottom out through reflexive activity people's belief in their own country, and now you have an overvalued institutional favorite that you could short sell and wait for something bad to happen to come up and suddenly collapse the whole thing. Why would Soros want to collapse the United States, though, besides his malicious pleasure in short selling institutional favorites? Well, he wants to transform the world into an open society. He doesn't have this hard CCP communist ambition. He wants a different open-ended Marxist ambition. He wouldn't call it Marxist, but it is. To have an open society. Well, if the U.S. is strong and rich, it can be exclusive. It can say, no, you can't actually come in. No, we're not going to put up with that. It can be an exclusive economy. It can use its power in the reserve currency of the world and the dollar to say, yes, you can do this, or no, you can do that. You could have Donald Trump initiate trade wars that actually achieve things without any shots having to be fired. Well, that would be no good. That's not an open society. That's one country having too much stuff and saying it can close its doors to other people whenever it wants. So you would fund exactly the opposite of that. The problem for Soros and his method, in fact, turns out to be that China is using it at least as, if not more effectively than his organizations can, and with vastly more resources, and he does not want that model. So he's kind of in this like weird end-of-life stage, watching his own program bear exactly the opposite fruit that he wanted it to, and I don't really feel bad for him on that. I said we were reading the book, The Great Narrative for the Better Future from Klaus Schwab earlier, and I said that they're going to use climate change as kind of the big lever. Of course, I mentioned previously it sets up a north-south dialectic that drives the immigration. Those are Kamala Harris's root cause. Climate change causes immigration, so we have to fix climate change instead of closing the border, blah, blah, blah. But they've upgraded this into the poly crisis. And then the great narrative for a better future. What is the great narrative that we're going to have for a better future? What are we going to tell our kids, our great narrative for a better future, right? It's that we have all these crises waiting to happen. Synthetic biology, pandemics, climate change, all these terrible things, AI, acceleration, drone warfare, all this stuff. Oh no, everything's very scary. Velocity, whatever velocity means, he mentions velocity a lot. Things are getting newer, faster than we can understand, basically. Oh no, so what's the great narrative? We can globally cooperate and hand power to the global stakeholders in order to run a global government to manage that for the future. In other words, if we just have all these problems coming that maybe, cyber attacks and every other bad thing, then we can hand off power to a global governance entity for a better future. It's just obviously a power grab to establish the stakeholder Soviet. So the tyranny of our future is opt-in. I've said that a lot of times. I want to break that down for you. The game is for opt-in tyranny is not that they're going to force you from without like industrial communism. They're just going to make life harder and harder and harder for you until you play along. It's a kind of top-down soft totalitarianism with that conditioned social pressure of, come on, get with the program, you do your part, we're all in this together, wear your mask. It requires a lot of things, though, like a heavy surveillance state, like Big Brother. It requires psychological operations to produce the appearance of demand for these things. That's going to happen through the nudge theory. It requires brainwashing to change the values of the population, especially the youth. But the deal is that you're going to actually end up brainwashing yourself with opt-in tyranny, because you don't have to go along with the program. It's cheap and easy to avoid going along with the program. Life just gets harder and harder and more uncomfortable until you do. Think about vaccine passports. You don't have to get one. You just can't eat inside a restaurant. You have to take your food and go. It's minor inconvenience. Oh, maybe we can't even have you come in the restaurant. You can only get delivery. Oh, well, maybe you can't even get delivery because what if the driver gets that? Well, you'll have to get delivery by drone. Well, you don't have drone delivery in your area? Well, you'll have to wait for that. So it just gets harder and harder and harder to have a good life, right? The vaccine passport was a great example where they tried to do this to us. And then Omicron came along like a miracle and made it so that seemed absolutely ridiculous, and we don't have that anymore. Imagine if they were to do like they've done in the UK and set up fines if you have an outdated vehicle or inadequate housing, right? So yeah, you can drive whatever car you want. You don't have to drive an electric car. It doesn't have to be a self-driving car that drives you around, that has a kill switch or anything else. You don't have to have any of that. You can have your American muscle car. It doesn't matter. It's just that every time you drive past this camera that's set up outside of your neighborhood, you get fined $75. Every single time. Every single time. You don't have to buy a compliant vehicle, or you don't have to install a smart meter on your house. Your property taxes just go up by 10% per year till you do. You see what I'm saying about making it? You have to choose. You have to say, yes, I want to participate in your evil system. You have to start your own self-criticism and self-transformation in order to do it. Now imagine this with social credit scores, which is the penultimate brainwashing program. You don't get a better brainwashing program than a social credit score except through chips in your brain. Basically, the social credit score turns life into a video game where the rules of the video game are set by somebody else, and your job is to run around and punch the boxes that give you the coins, that give you the points. You're going to do what you're supposed to do and get merits, and you're going to not do what you're not supposed to do and get demerits, and you're going to play the video game of life, and if your score is high enough, you can buy groceries. And if your score is even higher, you can buy better groceries. And if your score is too low, well, you know, here's a little bit of government cheese so you don't starve. And that's basically all you can have. So you'll rapidly brainwash yourself in order to stay in line with staying above the minimum standard. It's like your credit score already works now that you can't get a loan if you have a bad credit score or it has a high interest rate, but now it's applied to everything you do in life. Actually, I read the document published in 2014 by the CCP about why they implemented a social credit score, and they just talk on page after page after page after page about how it's necessary for the implementation of a modern socialism. That's what it's for. That's what the social credit score is all about. Getting everybody to behave, but also to train themselves to behave the right way. I pointed out the smart metered housing, but just imagine that those limits shrink and shrink and shrink until you live in your little sector of your 15-minute city, and it costs you a fine every time you leave, plus they surveil every time you leave, and maybe you have to start answering for why you leave, and that's tied to your social credit system. That all sets up kind of a double two-tiered system, the red-black categories of Maoism. There are the opt-ins, the compliant people. Those are the good citizens, good global citizens. And there are the people who resist, that opt out. Well, they can participate in society, but they're black class, so they maybe can't buy groceries except on a black market. And if they get caught, it's going to be really bad, right? But there's a second tier, which within the compliant people, there are the people who are good social credit and bad social credit. And they are also at like an intrinsic competition to raise social credit scores. Then you tie this into a universal basic income so that we don't really actually have to work. And they can just tell you, you know what, fine, forfeit your money. You don't have to take $1,200 or $500,000 or whatever dollars a month. When the UBI thing failed, by the way, they said the reason it probably failed where people wouldn't work because they had money coming in was because they didn't give them enough money. I'm not kidding. That's the explanation that they've come up with for this. You don't have to take the UBI. You don't have to be compliant in your social credit score or whatever to get UBI. Fine, do whatever you want. But it turns out that's the only money that you can get because there are like kind of no jobs, right? So it's opt into your own control and tyranny. You don't have to brainwash your kids. They just don't have a place in the future economy. You can homeschool your kids. You don't have to send them to the schools to get programmed in their competencies and social emotional learning, but they won't be able to get a job because they don't have the 21st century skills necessary for the workforce. Imagine this with central bank digital currency, which is kind of the ultimate tool. They can turn your money on and off and control what you can and can't buy with it. And they can tie it to a thing that would basically be sustainability credits that work like a carbon credit economy. When you're a good boy, you can have more credits, and when you're not a good boy, you don't have it. This is very, very strong Ingsoc feels to it. This is Shaw's kindly English socialism mixed with that Dengist economic model. Kindly justify your existence and you will have your UBI. You can just imagine it. And of course, it's all just more recycled Soviet communism. I want to read to you a piece, though, to give you a feel for what this is actually about from Decatur's Mao's Great Famine. He says, in the People's Republic, access to foods, goods, and services was largely determined by a household registration system, the rough equivalent of the internal passport instituted in December 1932 under Stalin in the Soviet Union. Introduced to the cities in 1951, it was extended to the countryside in 1955 and became law in 1958, just when farmers were being pitchforked into the communes. It divided people into two separate worlds by classifying them either as city dwellers or peasants. The household registration system was a linchpin of the planned economy. As the state was in charge of distribution of goods, it had to have a rough idea of the needs of different sectors of the economy. If large flows of people moved about the country in complete freedom, it would upset the production quotas and distribution charts so meticulously mapped out by the central planners. Okay, so imagine the capacity of controlling you with 15-minute cities and CBDC and all that, but listen to what the real point was. They had a planned, let's say, circular, steady-state economy that seems like it would be impossible to manage, and they couldn't run the planned economy unless people stayed put. And they knew exactly where everybody was so they could make reasonable guesses about exactly how much each area and each person might need. So their calculations depended on removing all of your freedom of movement. This is no different. It's the same program. And notice that it was a Soviet household registration program in the first place. Actually, it wasn't called the household registration program, except in China. So where did this theosophical religion go that we started with? Let's talk about the theosophy of the UN, and we'll end up here. So this probably, corporate communism might be the end of communism as communism. It's some new thing. That's fine. I still want to call it communism. Corporate communism is a good placeholder for our time. But it's going to get real weird with this UN vision if that's what's really where it's going. I recorded 2 very long podcasts about how weird the UN theosophy is. I encourage you to look up United Nations on my website and listen to those. I just want to offer you a taste of how crazy their ideas are, though. I'm not going to go into a huge amount of it. But I want to remind you that theosophy and Marxism are actually concerned with spiritual evolution through a kind of artificial selection of the people who are more compliant. That is a spiritual eugenics program. So how in the world would a spiritual eugenics program work? We know how a literal eugenics program works. You have the traits we like, you don't. Your noses are too big, your noses are too small, your skin color is right, your skin color is wrong. We know how that would work. Too tall, too short, right? Exoteric. How would a spiritual, esoteric one work? Did you comply or did you fail to comply? Are you re-educable or are you not re-educable? So people who comply are spiritually advanced and people who don't aren't. So you have an absolute totalitarian model determining who has value and who doesn't when they say that they want to guide the evolution of mankind. Positive agreement with the cult religion, which they call affirmation, is actually how they determine who succeeds and who fails, or who lives and who dies in such a program. So back to Robert Mueller. We started with Robert Mueller last night, or yesterday afternoon actually. We finished with Robert Mueller today. Humanity has achieved so much progress, has solved so many problems, avoided so many dangers, and yet now we face the most colossal problem in the entire human history and evolution. Namely, that industry, technology, commerce, transport, overpopulation, and overconsumption might destroy the very essence and future of the earth, including our own, namely its nature. We need innumerable great and small ideas and efforts to countervail that. So there's our great narrative for a better future and the poly crisis laid out right for you. It's in this whole model's at the United Nations. This was written in the 90s, before the Millennium Assembly for adoption going into this century. How about the socialist-capitalist dialectic? Is that in the UN? Like the capitalists and the communists did at the end of the last century, we should think hard and conceive how we can make the next century a paradise. Since both communism and capitalism have failed, and since we live in planetary conditions very different from those at the end of the last century, that means at the end of the 19th century, we must think afresh all of our current beliefs, doings, and institutions and formulate an entirely new ideology or dreamology for an unprecedented future in all human history. Heads of government, of corporations, and all human institutions should be excited by this new wonderful challenge. Again, this was written in the 90s. After communism and capitalism, frugalism might become the new ideology and rule of our behavior on Earth. Doesn't that sound like degrowth? Demanding from us more frugal and simple lives, lower standard of living, in order not to destroy life-giving nature. A new economic system must be born which will not produce colossal waste, unnecessary products, built-in rapid obsolescence, and colossal duplications between 185 nations. Frugalism, that's degrowth, and simplicity of life might become the salvation of the earth and future generations. The UN General Assembly 2000, at the heads of state level, must absolutely measure up to its historical tasks and be remembered for its audacity and long-term views of the future. It should, above all, decide to embark on the writing of a constitution for proper earth government. There's your global citizenship. If it does not, future historians will not forgive its members. At this stage of our evolution, the concepts of competition and survival of the fittest must be abandoned in favor of the concept of cooperation. There's your theosophical evolutionary thing. The whole future evolution of Earth and of humanity depends on it. Only cooperation will save the Earth and humanity. From now on, cooperation must be the supreme law of Earth and human survival. We must aim at a united Earth and nature. So that's corporate communism. Let me give you a summary of our workshop. Communism is the suite of a set of denominations. It's a suite of denominations of a broader theosophical transformative religion. We see it from the United Nations, we see it in the communists, we see it in the Corpus Hermeticum long before any of this, the same beliefs. We started talking about crude communism from Babeuf, and we mentioned the utopian socialists but didn't talk about them. Then we see Karl Marx brings the religious element in with transcendent communism, which is the first fully religious communism that brings all this theosophy into the picture. That doesn't go anywhere, so we end up with Eastern communism, which is a Lenin, Stalin, Mao, industrial state communism model to force this to happen. Mao's, it was called the People's Communism, sort of. Communism there worked as a state church. It went from authoritarian discipline to totalitarianism to a self-criticizing, self-brainwashing, totalizing philosophy of communism. But society will ultimately, in this model, be transformed by the party. It has the right idea, but history proved that it cannot produce. Meanwhile, in Western communism, cultural, critical, postmodern, woke, we have a negative communism that became a negative utopian communism where we would criticize everything wrong with the world to achieve the qualitative change necessary to get true liberation. It attacks the nature of capitalism at its fundamental roots. It can produce, but it has the wrong idea, that is, capitalism does, sorry. So we have to criticize that. And we have to overcome truth itself in order to be able to implement it, hence the postmodern part that we had to rely on. Through critical pedagogy and liberation theology, it became a communist revival religion throughout the West. It was a very personal communism, a personal relationship with the oppressed, or the concept of oppression actually in the abstract, because you don't really care about those dirty people. You don't want to be anywhere near them because you're an upper middle class wealthy person. As this all mixed and matched, it became an American Maoism that was utterly personalized to the smallest levels to create cells of transformation that could infiltrate every institution and transform them from within with an intersectional new sensibility. And this gave us corporate communism, which is a dialectical synthesis of this productive socialism that they built in the East and a sustainable capitalism they are forcing on us with a corporate cartel in the West. And what will happen through all of this opt-in tyranny that it brings into the nudge theory and whatever else, and the algorithmic nudging in particular, is in the end the ability for you even to think for yourself. And then even if you've been synthetically produced as such, you'll be the new man, and it will work this time. And this is exactly what we see culminating with the nearly naked expressions of esoteric faith of communism as they're appearing in the United Nations as they rushed into the Millennium Assembly 25 years ago. Whether they're technically communist or not doesn't really matter because it's the exact same overarching religion. It's just a difference in slightly difference in views and methods. It's still collectivist. It's still transformative. So the first quote that I read in this workshop was from Robert Muller's 2000 Ideas. I just read a bunch more, but I'm going to end with one more to prove my point. He said, the United Nations should not be called an organization, but a metabiological organism. The United Nations should be considered an organism, a metabiological organism. It constantly adapts and transforms itself to reflect truthfully the overall evolution of the planet and of humanity, highlighting our errors and damages to our home, correcting our evolutionary course, and giving us new vistas of a great new future. To which I say, abolish the United Nations. Communism is this religion. It is not coming, it is here. We have to stop it. Thank you for coming here.